pleasure this evening to introduce the moderator of this debate, Mr. William F. Poe. The role of the moderator in a formal debate such as this is certainly an indispensable one. The moderator relinquishes his or her own rights of expression on this particular topic for a higher calling, that of maintaining open channels of communication between divergent viewpoints. It's only through those open channels of communication that we learn and then understand. Sometimes the role of the moderator can be a difficult one. I speak from experience here, but I'm sure that all of the accomplished gentlemen with us this evening will ensure that it's not the case tonight. Mr. William F. Poe is a Tampa native, as are his wife and children. He graduated from Hillsborough High School and the University of Florida with a business degree. All of you know of his successful tenure as mayor of Tampa from 1974 to 1975 and the impetus he gave to the new economic development our city now enjoys. You may also know of his business accomplishments with his insurance firm of Poe & Associates. But you may not know of his numerous and truly generous record of community service. He has served with the Sertoma Club, the Boys Club of Tampa, the Seminole Heights Baptist Church, the American Red Cross, the United Way, the YMCA, and Goodwill Industries. Mr. Poe has also received so many various recognitions in business, government, and community service that I could not name them all this evening. I give you a truly community-spirited citizen, Mr. William F. Poe.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Marsh. We'll go right into the debate. We are going to have about a 3-hour program, and I will go through the format in just a moment. But first, let me read the topic: resolve that scientific creationism is a better model than evolution for correlating and predicting the origin and history of the universe of life. The format that we're going to follow tonight is as follows. Dr. Gish will be the affirmative speaker, will be first, followed by Dr. Miller. The negative, or the evolutionist, on each will have 30 minutes. That will then be followed by another discussion, each 30 minutes in the same order. We will then have a 5-minute intermission, and then we will be followed by rebuttal. Rebuttal, it will be in the same order of 15 minutes each, and then a second rebuttal of 5 minutes each. Following that, we will have approximately 4 questions from the audience, and they will be directed to equally between the two debaters. We would appreciate it very much if you care to, at the end of each section, if you would like to applause, please feel free to do so. And we would appreciate it if everyone will try to hold down on any of the interim applause so that we can be sure to hear the debate. I'm going to introduce both speakers or debaters right now, and after the introductions, the debate will begin. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest and our debater and speaker, a gentleman who is going to be on the affirmative side of the issue of creation. Won't you welcome him, Dr. Duane Gish. Dr. Gish. Dr. Gish received a B.S. degree from UCLA and holds a Ph.D. degree in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley. He pursued research in biochemistry for a period of 18 years, first at Berkeley, then at Cornell University, and finally, for an extended period of years, at the Upjohn Company. During these years, Dr. Gish became involved in the creation, testimony, speaking, and writing. In 1970, he joined the faculty of the Christian Heritage College and became professionally involved in the creation movement. Dr. Gish is now the Associate Director of the Institute for Creation Research. He's authored several books on various aspects of the scientific evidence for creation and against evolution. Our second guest, our second speaker and debater, is a gentleman who is speaking on the evolution side of the issue. Won't you welcome him, coming to us from Brown University, Dr. Kenneth Miller. Dr. Miller received his B.S. degree from Brown University and his Ph.D. in biology from the University of Colorado. He taught at the University of Colorado, was an assistant professor at Harvard University, and has been an assistant professor at Brown University since 1980. He is a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Society for Cell Biology. Dr. Miller has a number of research interests and has had many, many papers and articles published. He also was one of our guests in last year's debate at Jefferson High School. At this time, we will start the debate, and on the affirmative, Dr. Duane Gish. Dr. Gish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poe. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Miller, certainly is a pleasure for me to be here this evening and to present to you some of the results of my research on the subject of origins, the nature of the evidence that has convinced me as a scientist that the theory of evolution is scientifically untenable, and that the concept of direct spatial creation is a far better explanation of the scientific evidence related to origins. Now, first of all, I want to dispense with this notion, in case someone has that notion, that this is a debate between science on one hand and religion on the other. Actually, neither creation nor evolution is a valid scientific theory. You see, the entire subject of origins is outside the limits of empirical science. For obviously there were no human witnesses to the origin of the universe. There were no human witnesses to the origin of life. There was no human witnesses to the origin of a single living thing. These events were unique, unrepeatable, historical events of the past. That is the stuff of history, not the stuff of science. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. Now, we can never ultimately prove or disprove either one. That cannot be done because there is always some way to wiggle out of the difficulty. You just make your theory, you alter your theory, you see, to account for any contradictory evidence. Now, that can be done with both creation and evolution. Now, the theory, which is the best theory, then, would be the one that would be the simplest and would contain the fewer number of contradictions that demand an explanation. Now, in approaching the subject of origins, we use the same processes that we use in all areas of science. We use observation and logic. Now, the first slide, please. And here on the slide, now supposing you're walking along a trail or a hillside and you glance down and you see this arrowhead among that group of pebbles. Now, using your powers of observation and logic, you would very reasonably conclude that the pebbles were formed by natural processes through time. But on the other hand, you would also equally logically conclude that the arrowhead had a creator. You could see the design and the purpose of this arrowhead. And you would conclude there's an arrowhead maker. Now, you've never seen the arrowhead maker, and you never will see the arrowhead maker. But you conclude that he does exist. Furthermore, you would not ascribe the creation of that arrowhead to a beaver or a snake or a monkey. You would ascribe its origin solely to human activity. That's a very logical and reasonable conclusion, you see. Now, we can do that in all aspects of this question. We look out and we see this incredibly complex universe, highly ordered and structured, fully predictable, at least as far as the location of planets and things are concerned. And then life itself, unbelievably complex, with purpose in every detail of its structure and function, and marvelously coordinated in time and space. And we can logically and reasonably conclude, likewise, there had to be a creator. We've never, if you've, of course, never seen that creator, you can't actually touch him. That does not tell us there is no creator. Logically, we can see the evidence for it, you see. There must be a creator. Now, each theory also is equally religious. Belief in creation does increase one's confidence in the Christian Judaic view and in that belief. Belief in theism is tremendously strengthened when we realize the fact of creation. On the other hand, belief in evolution does tend to encourage belief in atheism, agnosticism, and humanism in general. And the problem, you see, of teaching evolution exclusively in our public schools is when that is done, when it's taught as a fact, to the exclusion of the scientific evidence for creation, then this tends to convince millions of our young people that there is no God, that they're hardly more than a mechanistic product of a mindless universe. There's no one to whom they are responsible. They're solely responsible to themselves, which is precisely what George Gaylord Simpson said in one of his books on paleontology, and he is one of the leading evolutionists. The fact is, the American Humanist Association, which is, of course, an organization of atheists, mainly, has defined humanism as the belief that man shapes his own destiny. It is a constructive philosophy, a non-theistic religion. And in that same literature, they quote Sir Julian Huxley, the British biologist and evolutionist, who says, "I use the word humanist to mean someone who believes that man is just as much a natural phenomenon as an animal or plant, that his body, mind, and soul were not supernaturally created, but are products of evolution, and that he is not under the control or guidance of any supernatural being or being, but has to rely on himself and his own powers." End of quote. So you see, when evolution then is taught, when young people are indoctrinated in this particular philosophy, it tends to convert those people to a materialistic, mechanistic, atheistic philosophy. I know my opponent does not hold that particular philosophy, but nevertheless, when this is done, this is the practical result. You see, this involves some sort of worldview, a certain philosophy, you see. And so it does have, each one of these, of course, have important, vastly important implications why we're concerned about the problem. Next slide, please. Here on this slide, we see the definition of evolution by Sir Julian Huxley, which was published in What is Science in 1955. Notice that Huxley says, evolution in the extended sense can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. End of quote. All right, then here we see the definition of evolution according to Huxley. Notice, it is a process of self-transformation. Now, every evolutionist believes that. He says that he can go out into the world, study natural laws and natural processes now operating, and without using any outside intervention of any kind, certainly excluding the supernatural, he can explain the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of everything. By definition, the evolutionist excludes the intervention of God. the theory of evolution. Whether the evolutionist is an atheist or a theist or what, the theory of evolution is an atheistic theory. By definition, any outside intervention of any kind, God or otherwise, is excluded. Notice, as Huxley says, it's a process of self-transformation. Matter did it all. Matter had this inherent capability of transforming itself into what we have in the world today. Notice that it's a directional process. It goes in one direction only, leading to ever and ever higher levels of organizations in its products. It goes from disorder to order. It goes from simple to complex. It goes from chaos to the cosmos, always in that direction. And notice that it includes everything. Everything is the process of evolution. The origin of the universe, the origin of life on this planet, of course the origin of our planet, the origin of the solar system, the origin of all living things, the origin of culture and the origin of our religion can all be ascribed to this evolutionary process. That is the general theory of evolution. The late Professor Harlow Shapley of Harvard University said, "Some people piously proclaim in the beginning God. I say in the beginning hydrogen." And Professor Shapley claimed that beginning with hydrogen and natural laws and time, one could explain the origin of everything. Well, of course, he could do no such thing. But this concept was consistent with his philosophy. I am reminded, as someone has said, that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given enough time, becomes people. Now, of course, that is precisely what evolutionists believe, exactly what they believe. You see, according to the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe, which most people accept, most evolutionists, all the energy and matter in the universe was crammed together in some huge cosmic egg billions of years ago. Now, no one has the foggiest notion where this cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Someone suggested perhaps the cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. Well, who knows? Nobody knows where it came from. There it was, just like that. Zap, you had a cosmic egg. And then, for some strange reason, this cosmic egg exploded. And here we are today, people, with 30 trillion cells in our bodies of over 200 varieties, with 12 billion brain cells in our 3-pound human brain with 120 trillion connections, 120 beautifully, marvelously coordinated, marvelously arranged connections, 120 trillion of them, and we're all the product of hydrogen, according to this theory. Because you see, sometime after the Big Bang, all there was in this entire universe was hydrogen, just a cloud of hydrogen. And the cloud of hydrogen was expanding out of the universe, in the vast stretches of the universe. And then somehow, that cloud of hydrogen converted itself into stars and planets and galaxies, our solar system, and people. And that is the story. And they say, we are told, of course, of the vast stretch of time required. Maybe 20 billion years, maybe 10 billion years. They're not quite sure how much time was involved. But it was a vast stretch of time. I'm also reminded that it has been said that if you say a frog changed into a prince instantaneously, that's just a fable. But if you say a frog changed into a prince and it took 300 million years, that's science. Well, I think it takes more than 300 million years to change a fable into science. The idea that a frog changes into a prince instantaneously is a fairy tale for children. And the idea that a frog or some amphibian changed into people in 300 million years is a fairy tale for grown-ups. And has no substance as far as science is concerned in such an idea. Well, that is in essence the theory of evolution. There are submodels, of course, in the mechanism. We'll talk about that later on this evening. But that, in its essence, is the general theory of evolution, the particles to people theory, the molecules to man theory. I sometimes call it the fish to Gish theory of evolution. So we know that we're talking about something like that. Now, we want to contrast this theory to creation, the general creation model. The creation scientist says no, the universe could not have created itself naturally. It had to be created supernaturally. He says a creator, if you'll pardon me, I'll refer to that creator as God. God created this universe. He introduced a high degree of order and complexity within the universe. He created the stars and planets directly. He created our solar system, created the earth to be the habitation of living things. And on this earth, he created the basic living types of plants and animals, the created kinds, if you will, the dog kind, the cat kind, the monkey kind, the gibbon kind, the orang kind, and the snake kind, and the turtle kind, and the lizard kind. These basic types of creatures were created. Now, within each kind, there was limited variability within the circumscribed boundaries of each one of these created kinds. God created each kind with sufficient genetic potential or variability to allow each kind to spread to various parts of the earth, to populate various parts of the earth, to adapt to various conditions, you see. So there was this variability, but what we are seeing that cats and dogs have not come from a common ancestor. The snakes, turtles, lizards, and crocodiles were each separately created. And apes, monkeys, and people were each separately created. Now there are submodels within that general creation model. There are those who call themselves progressive creationists. They accept all the assumptions in the dating methods that are used to assign a very old age to the earth, and they say the earth probably is somewhere between 4 and 5 billion years old, that God apparently created the first living things, that little microscopic organisms 3 billion years ago. He created the invertebrates about 600 million years ago, fishes maybe 50 million years later. He created the amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and finally man, perhaps a few 100,000 years ago. They are creationists. They believe in direct creation, but they accept this idea or this concept of earth history. Then there are some who even call themselves, they believe in some sort of a gap theory based upon certain theological considerations, which I won't discuss. They think possibly there were 2 creations. And then there was a long time gap after the first creation, followed by a destruction and a recreation in a relatively brief time and relatively recently. And so we have that kind of creationists. And then there are the creationists who believe that creation did take place in a relatively brief time and relatively recently. And they incorporate as part of their model catastrophism, as contrasted to the uniformitarianism of most evolutionists. Velikovsky was one of the exceptions. But most evolutionists believe that present processes acting essentially at present rates over hundreds of millions of years of time could produce everything we see in geology. The catastrophists say, no, you cannot account for these geological formations that way. There have been catastrophes, and even particularly one vast worldwide catastrophe or flood. And they incorporate all of that information into their particular creation model. So we have several submodels within the creation model, and we have several submodels within the evolution model. Now, I want to take a look at the mechanism for evolution. Now, you see, the evolutionist says that he can use natural laws and processes which are now operating to explain everything. Therefore, his theory must be in accord with these natural laws and these natural processes. There must be no contradiction, you see, between those laws and his theory. He has a mechanistic theory, a naturalistic theory, and so it must be in accord with these processes. Now, the evolutionist says, most evolutionists says, that evolution has proceeded, of course, over 3 billion years of time. Life came into existence about 3 billion years ago, and so it's taken 3 billion years to produce what we have today. Now, you'd have to say that has to be a gradual process. Man just didn't pop into existence. He came into existence over this 3 billion years of time. Now, you've got to have some mechanism. Well, the mechanism that most evolutionists accept is that of mutations with natural selection. Mutations are changes in the genetic material, changes in the genes. Each gene is a very long and complex molecule, thousands of subunits in each one of these genes. A mutation may be just a typographical error, It may be caused by X-rays, cosmic rays, ultraviolet light, chemicals, something like that, such as thalidomide. It may cause a mutation. And that means that one of those subunits, one of those letters in the genes has changed into another one. We put the wrong one in there. Now, if you have a highly complicated, highly complex message and you make a random change in it, you can know that it's going to produce bad things. And these mutations are random. They are accidents. They are mistakes. No intelligent being says, now this must happen, this ought to happen, let's do this, let's do that because the environment's changed. No, it's just an accident, just a mistake. Now, most of these mistakes obviously would be bad, and the evolutionists do acknowledge that most are bad. They produce all kind of bad things. Among humans, they produce sickle cell anemia, diabetes, Tay-Sachs disease, phenylketonuria, produce blindness, sterility, and hundreds of other genetic diseases. But the evolutionist needs, he must have some method of change, so he postulates somehow, just by accident now, by pure accident, one of these mistakes occasionally happens to be good. And it changes the plant or animal in some beneficial way, so now the animal has gained some advantage over the original. He reproduces now in larger numbers than the original, and so he eventually replaces it. They call that natural selection. That's all natural selection is, just differential reproduction. Some animals reproduce in larger numbers than others. That's how evolution goes. So now we've effected a very slight change, and now we sit around for hundreds and thousands of years. A lot of bad things happen in the meantime, but they get kicked out because they're bad. And then finally, lo and behold, another accident happens that's good. And so again, it changes the animal or plant in a beneficial way, and he replaces the original. And then we go around for another thousands of years, maybe I don't know how many years, but a long stretch of time, and then another happy accident happens, and a series of these happy accidents, and we've changed the little single-cell organism into people, and onions, and tigers, and everything else on this earth has come about by this process of mistakes. Loren Isley says, man is the product of millions of DNA accidents scattered through several billion years of time. Carl Sagan said that here we are today, brains and all, as a result of the death of millions of slightly maladapted organisms. That's the theory. Now, next slide, please. Here on this slide, we see some flying reptiles. They're extinct now. We're grateful for that. These flying reptiles supposedly evolved from a land reptile. In the lower portion of the slide, you see a pteranodon. He has a long, toothless beak, about 3 feet long. So, according to theory, he started out with jaws and teeth. Gradually evolved into a toothless beak. I don't have the foggiest notion what he was eating and how he managed to chew all that time, but he got by somehow. And that bony crest gradually evolved, and the 4th finger started out the normal size. Eventually, it got long enough to support a wingspread of 52 feet, which is greater than the F-4 Phantom jet. Now, according to evolutionary theory, we had this land reptile with an ordinary hand. An ordinary land reptile. Did very well on the land. He really was competing very nicely. Obviously, he wouldn't be here, you see. And then an accident happened, a genetic accident, a mistake happened, and his finger got just a wee bit longer. And would you believe it, that conveyed some survival value on this reptile. It gave him some advantage of some kind. I don't have the foggiest notion what it was, but he replaced the original reptile with the ordinary hand. And then maybe a few thousand years later, another one of those accidents happened, and his finger got a wee bit longer again. Now, it didn't affect the other fingers. Now, for some strange reason, none of the other fingers were affected, just that 4th finger. And got a wee bit longer. And then he sat around, and millions or maybe thousands of years later, another accident happened. His finger got a wee bit longer, and so forth and so on. And over this millions of years of time, that finger got longer and longer and longer and longer. Now, obviously, a reptile running around with a long finger, that's not going to do any good. He had to have, if he's going to fly, he had to have a wing membrane, had to have flight muscles and everything. And would you believe it? Some of these accidents happen, now just mistakes, you see, in the genetic material, and it happened to generate a wing membrane. Of course, just flapping around a little bit. And first, I don't know what in the world to use that wing membrane for. It couldn't fly or anything like that. It sure wasn't very handy for running around on the ground and competing with other reptiles. It seemed to me to be a tremendous disadvantage. And he had to have flight muscles. Now, you see, the muscles that works in your forelimbs, they will not work for flight. You had to completely restructure the muscles. and the nerve supply and the blood supply and everything. But would you believe it? All these thousands and perhaps millions of mistakes just managed to beautifully coordinate, and eventually we had this wonderful flying machine, this pteranodon, with an enormously long finger, a flight and a wing membrane, flight muscles, hollow bones, and everything else. And here we had him, this marvelous flying machine. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I've got some very serious doubts about that theory and that mechanism. I just don't have the foggiest notion how the intermediates would have functioned. How in the world could those things survive until he got out in the air? Now, he couldn't even sail. He couldn't even jump off of a branch and sail at first. He couldn't do that. Total washout's what he would be. But somehow he evolved. We are told. You know what? There's not a trace of an intermediate stage. Do you know that supposedly it took millions of years of time for a land reptile to evolve into a flying reptile? The jaws and teeth gradually changed into that long beak. That bony crest gradually evolved from some bony knob or something, and the finger got longer and longer and longer, and somehow the wing membrane was gradually generated and so forth over millions of years of time, and we cannot find one single transitional form. Suddenly we have flying reptiles. The pteranodon, Rhamphorhynchus, and other flying reptiles suddenly appear in the fossil record complete without a single transitional form. The next slide, please. And here we see in the lower portion of the slide a plesiosaur. The plesiosaur is a marine reptile, also extinct. Supposedly these plesiosaurs evolved from land reptiles, just like the flying reptile. And so again we had this marvelous process, all these mistakes, somehow converted a land reptile into a marine reptile. Some land reptile ventured into the water and managed to stick around now in the sea, and over eons of time he slowly and gradually evolved into a plesiosaur with paddles for feet and legs. And the ichthyosaur, another reptile that looks very much like a fish and swim like a fish. And would you believe it? Not one single transitional form has ever been found. Millions and millions of years of evolution and no transitional forms. Now we are told that one of these land reptiles, you see, the fish evolved into an amphibian. That's a transformation from water to land. The amphibian evolved into a land reptile. The land reptile evolved into the marine reptile. Later on, one of these land reptiles evolved into a land mammal. Then eventually the land mammal evolved into a marine mammal. And these marine mammals included whales and dolphins. I had a great time yesterday watching the dolphins out in the bay going after a school of fish. Marvelous, wonderful creatures, beautifully designed for life in the water. What do evolutionists say about whales and dolphins? Well, here's an article that appeared as a fold-out in the National Geographic, December 1976, entitled Whales of the World. The author says the whale's ascendancy to sovereign size apparently began 60 million years ago when hairy four-legged mammals in search of food or sanctuary ventured into the water. As eons passed, changes slowly occurred. Hind legs disappeared. Front legs changed into flippers. Hair gave way to a thick, smooth blanket of blubber. Nostrils moved to the top of the head. The tail broadened into flukes, and in the buoyant water world, the body became enormous. And
2 minutes, Dr. Gish.
2 minutes. So according to this story then, some hairy four-legged mammal evolved into a whale. Now here's an article appeared in Scientific American entitled Dolphins, and this was in March 1979 by Dr. Bernd Wirsig. Dr. Wirsig says that dolphins evolved at least 50 million years ago from land mammals that may have resembled even-toed ungulates of today, such as cattle, pigs, and buffalo. All right, that's what he said. Cattle, pigs, and buffalo, something like that. Ventured in the water and evolved into a whale or a dolphin or something like that. Well, a friend of mine got together an artist and tried to visualize what these transitional forms look like. We see those in the next slide. All right, we see that the cow got into the water. That's what they said, something that may have resembled a cow, pig, or buffalo. Got in the water, and listen, they said she stayed around the water for eons of time as her tail broadened into flukes, the hind legs disappeared, and the front legs changed into flippers. And I suppose if we had a failure and that thing hanging underneath, we'd just call it an utter failure. But fortunately, everything succeeded, and we finally ended up with a whale. Now, my challenge to Dr. Miller and to all evolutionists is the following. If you don't like these suggestions, what are yours? I'd be delighted to see what your suggestions are. How did some hairy four-legged mammal get in the water, stick around for eons of time as it gradually and slowly evolved into a whale which is wonderfully and marvelously designed for life in the water? You see, when it comes right down to a specific case, the whole idea of evolution is an absurdity.
Time.
Thank you.
Dr. Miller has 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. I have to say that I really enjoyed Dr. Gish's presentation, but I noticed a couple of funny things about it, and I hope that you did too. One of them was that he kept his creation model a secret. He didn't tell us in detail why it is the living world and the fossil world look the way they do. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not asking how the Creator did his stuff. That would sort of be a trade secret. And I understand we can't ask questions about that. But we can ask what was created and when and why things look the way they do. Now, though Dr. Gish was a little bit too reticent to let us in on too much of his model, you can look it up for yourself in some of the publications that are on sale outside. And you'll find the following 4 essential points. The first is that the Earth and the entire universe are less than 10,000 years old. The second is that all living things appeared suddenly and essentially simultaneously, sort of a side-by-side creation, including all extinct species. Dr. Gish may have paid lip service to progressive creation, but he doesn't believe it, and there are extensive arguments against it in the books which his own institute publishes. The third point is that all of the fossil-containing geological formations of the Earth were formed in a single worldwide flood that lasted just 300 days and occurred about 6,000 years ago. And the fourth is sort of a negative postulate, and that is that evolution is not possible, and that's mostly what we've heard so far tonight. Now, evolution, as you know, suggests that the Earth is a lot older, that living things did not appear simultaneously, but rather appeared separately over millions and millions of years, and that the mechanisms of genetic change exist which can allow many species to derive from other species in a way that allows for the common ancestry of all living things, including human beings. Now, sometimes in science, two theories make predictions that are very, very close, and we have to measure things very carefully to be able to distinguish between them. Not tonight. These two predictions are light years apart. They are so different that we ought to be able to easily disprove one or the other. We can expect that we can look down into the ground or up into the sky, and the truth will stare us in the face. And you know what? It does. It stares us in the face. Now, we start right away with a problem. What do we mean by the term creationist? Now, in the ordinary usage of the English language, a creationist is anybody who believes in creation. In other words, anybody who believes in God. Now, by that standard, I'm a creationist too, because I'm also a Christian. And by that standard, so are many, if not most, of the biological scientists in this country. But tonight, in order to make sense of the discussion, we will have to take a different meaning for the word creationism, and I want you all to understand that it's a different meaning. For our purposes, creationism will have to mean young Earth, simultaneous appearance of living things, worldwide flood, and so forth. Now, I don't like to use the word that way because, of course, creationism means something more general and something with which I happen to agree. But tonight, that is the special meaning we have to assign the word. Now, you realize, I hope, that evolution says nothing about a creator. It can't, because science has no way to answer the question of creation one way or another. Now, Dr. Gish may have said that because evolution excludes a creator, it's an inherently atheistic theory. That's not true. Organic chemistry doesn't mention a creator. Immunology doesn't mention a creator. Long division doesn't mention a creator. Does that make long division inherently atheistic? Now, I'll make a prediction, and that is that tonight my distinguished opponent will, as he has with his arrowhead and other slides, make many, many arguments that a creator must exist. And he would like you to believe that each argument so made is a point in favor of scientific creationism and a point against evolution. But I ask you to understand that such arguments, whether they're correct or not, are theology rather than science. They happen, by the way, to be theology with which I agree. But I'm not going to, on account of that, I'm not going to argue with Dr. Gish. But I hope that each of you will understand that Dr. Gish, in order to establish his case tonight, cannot just argue theology for the existence of a creator. He has to argue natural history to prove young Earth, simultaneous creation, and so forth. Now, to establish this point, I will read a quote by a leading evolutionist, Stephen Stanley. He says, and I quote, "Atheism or the denial of existence of a divinity is as illegitimate is the word he uses for atheism, within science as is theism. Science simply does not deal with divinities. Observations and measurements are the raw material of science. Revelations, both personal and spiritual, are the raw material of religion, unquote. The non-religious character of evolution is really very plain. Evolution, like any scientific theory, is not atheistic, it is non-theistic, because it properly admits that it can say nothing about whether there's a God or not. Now, my aim, as you might have expected, is to show that creationism is not science. Now, when I was here last September with Dr. Henry Morris, we had an argument about that because Dr. Morris thinks otherwise. Can I have the first slide, please? Here you have Dr. Morris saying that creation is a scientific theory which fits all the facts of true science and so forth and so on. And in another quote he says, we conclude that the special creation theory is the best theory strictly on the scientific merits of the case. Tonight, Dr. Gish and I are in complete agreement, in contrast to Dr. Morris. And in the next slide, you'll see that Dr. Gish has come right out and said that creationism is not a scientific theory. It cannot qualify as a scientific theory, so our agreement on that is complete. I propose that in your next debate, perhaps you should have Dr. Morris and Dr. Gish, and they could argue back and forth about whether creationism is science or not. I'd really like to be there if you have that. But let me show you one little example of what happens when scientific creationism pretends to be science. The next slide shows a quote from Dr. Morris, one of his scientific predictions, and he says that the most probable date for man's origin based on known data from population statistics is about 6,300 years ago, which is 4,325 BC. That's very interesting. Next slide shows how Dr. Morris figured that out. Up in the very top, there are population statistics on the right-hand side of that graph from the 19th century that Dr. Morris used as reasonable estimates for the rate of population growth before modern medicine. He then extrapolated backwards, as we do sometimes in science when you have a logarithmic progression, and he discovered that the total population of the world would have come down to 2 6,300 years ago. And therefore, that's his derivation of the most scientific, creationist, reasonable date for the origin of man. Well, I thought that was interesting, so I did a few calculations. If you take the graph and you take 2600 BC and you extrapolate down the way I've done there with the dotted red lines, you'll discover that at 2600 BC, there must have been 600 people on the earth if Dr. Morris's calculations are right. Next slide. Now we have some facts. The first fact is that Egypt constitutes about 1% of the land area of the earth. Now, the conclusion from that fact is that if Egypt had a fair share of the Earth's population at the time, about 1%, then since there were 600 people around, according to Dr. Morris, that would have left 6 people in ancient Egypt at 2600 BC. Now, I found that very interesting. Next slide. The other historical fact, and it's established very clearly by historical records of the Egyptian dynasties, which incidentally agree almost totally with the Bible and confirm this very nicely, that the Great Pyramids were built in Egypt at around 2600 BC, and we have the conclusion based on creation science, it's in the next slide, that the Great Pyramids were built by 6 people. Now, this was derived originally by Dave Milne, a friend of mine at Evergreen, and I respectfully disagree with Dr. Milne. I'm almost positive the Pharaoh wouldn't have been out there, and I'm pretty sure he didn't put his wife to work either, so we'll make it 4. Now, this is precisely what creationist science pretends to do. Now, my opponent and his colleague, Dr. Morris, who I will henceforth refer to as creationist, even though I don't like to use the word that way, say that this planet and the universe are 10,000 years old, tops. I will suggest, as do most scientists, that the Earth is about 5 billion years old and the universe itself is even older than that. Now, that's a really big difference. That's not a hair splitter. That's 50 million%. That's billions and billions of times of difference, as a certain scientist who appears on television a lot might like to say. Now, how can we determine how old the universe really is? Well, the speed of light, for example, is a universal constant. Now, if the universe had been created 10,000 years ago, the most distant object that we could see should be about 10,000 light years away. So we can look up into the sky, as I suggested, and see what stares us in the face. Next slide. What stares us in the face is bad news for Dr. Gish. This is the Whirlpool Galaxy. It's 1,000,000 light years away. That's not a little problem for Dr. Gish. That is a big old problem because it means that there's a 10,000% error, at least in the age of the universe. Now, it gets even worse because the next slide shows the most distant object that has ever been visualized. It's in the lower right-hand corner. It's a galaxy detected by the orbiting Einstein X-ray Observatory. It's 12 billion light years away. 12 billion years. That's the evidence. That's what stares us in the face. Is there anything up there in the sky that suggests even for a second that the Earth could be 10,000 years old? The answer to that is not a thing. So what does Dr. Gish have to do, friends? He has to say, well, maybe the Creator made all these photons in midstream to make the universe look a whole lot older than what it really is. In other words, he has to say that the Creator was determined to fool us. And the essence of that explanation is saying that the evidence doesn't matter. Okay, how about the age of the Earth? You all know that there are various radioactive elements on this planet, and that all of these elements decay, some of them over billions and billions of years. I have to watch that. Carl Sagan actually went to the same high school as I did, and I pick it up from time to time. It's very difficult. The rate of these decay processes, for those of you who don't like Carl Sagan, Milton Friedman also went to that high school. The rates of these decay processes is so precise that, as you know, atomic clocks are used in the laboratory for the most precise sorts of timekeeping. Now, what does the overall atomic composition of this planet tell us? The first thing it tells us, and this disappointed a lot of atheists, believe me, is that the planet is not infinitely old. The reason for that is that all the elements would have decayed away, but they're still here, as the arms race will testify, so the planet could not be infinitely old. Now, how long ago did it have its origin? How long did it begin? Well, if it was recent, like 10,000 years, it'd be easy to tell. There are 47 nuclides, or radioactive elements, with short half-lives. They have half-lives between 1,000 and 50 million years. If the planet was recently formed, then some of these should be around. They couldn't have all decayed in just 10,000 years, and we should find them in detectable amounts. And if we find even one, it has to testify that the creation of the planet was a recent event. Now, 7 of those nuclides are formed all the time by cosmic ray interactions and other things, so they don't count. But the other 40 provide the test. How many of these 40 nuclides that would prove that Dr. Gish is right, got 40 chances, are present in detectable amounts, even detectable amounts, to show that creation is recent? Here's the next slide. 0. 0 for 40. None of them are there. On the other hand, the test we'd apply to evolution is the following. There are 17 nuclides with very long half-lives. If the Earth is old, we should have at least a few of those around. We can then go out, we can see if there are any of them around, we can come back in the lab, and we can decide what the answer is. And the answer is 17 out of 17. Every single one of the long ones are there. What is the evidence? The evidence is that the Earth is old. In desperation, I think, the creationist has to say that the Creator intentionally left these isotopes around, I suppose just to fool us. I have a lot of trouble believing that my Creator is so deceptive and so deceitful he'd pull a trick like this on us. But evidently Dr. Gish does not. Now, it gets better and better and better, but the fact is that this planet did have a beginning, and that beginning was about 4.5 billion years ago, and the first postulate of special creation is wrong. That's all there is to it. Now, Dr. Gish is a really good debater. I respect him immensely. His debating prowess is legendary in the scientific community. And he has a number of ways of handling this little problem of being off by an amount of 50 million%. The first of these is the most clever, and that is to say, well, we creationists can be open-minded because we can accept any age for the planet, but on the other hand, you evolutionists, you have to demand an age of billions of years, so you guys have to be dogmatic about the evidence. Now, I hope my opponent will not use that rhetorical solution tonight, because he really does have an answer to the age of the universe, and I hope he's honest about it as Dr. Henry Morris is. What does Dr. Morris say? Quote, "The only way we can determine the true age of the Earth is for God to tell us what it is. And since he has told us very plainly in the Holy Scriptures that it is several thousand years and no more, that ought to settle all basic questions of terrestrial chronology." So, ladies and gentlemen, let's not let Dr. Gish get away with saying that the age of the evolution, the age of the universe doesn't matter to creationists. After all, I hate to see him get in trouble with his boss. The unemployment rate is high enough already, and I don't want to add one more statistic in California. The scientific creationist does have an age for the Earth. Dr. Morris has given to you, and it's a few thousand years, and that's it. Now, there's another approach which is sometimes taken to squirm out of the 50 million% error, and that is to say that, well, there are other methods that tell us that the Earth is young, you know, and those methods are just as good as the radioactivity ones. Now, there are dozens and dozens of such methods that the creationists like to refer to, but let me show you what happens when you look in detail at the method that the creationists will often say is the very best of the young Earth method. Next slide. Dr. Thomas Barnes, who's a creationist physicist or engineer who worked at the University of Texas at El Paso, has seized upon the fact that of measurements made of the strength of the Earth's magnetic field in the last 130 years, that's the only time which we have measurements for, the strength of the field has been decreasing steadily. The boxes are each individual published experimental measurement. Now, Dr. Barnes says the rate of that decrease is exponential, which means it curves downward and has a half-life of 1,300 years. Now, I've drawn both the exponential and the linear curves on the graph that fit that data, and you can see that they're so close it's very difficult to call. But the next slide shows what Dr. Barnes has done, and I'm not going to argue with that. And that is, he's taken those tiny little bits of observation inside the circle and has extended them backwards for thousands and thousands of years. And he says, gee, when we go back about 10,000 years ago, the magnetic field must have been so strong that the Earth would have been like a magnetic star. That doesn't sound possible. It's not possible. In fact, so the Earth can't be older than 10,000 years. That's the proof. Well, that's very interesting. The only problem is that if you open a geology textbook, you'll find a little difficulty. Next slide. And that is that the Earth's rocks carry a record of the magnetic field strength and direction at the time of their formation, known as paleomagnetism. And geologists have discovered that that record shows that the Earth's magnetic field has fluctuated. It's gone bing, bang, 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 up and down every few million years for the last 100 million years or so. In other words, the thing that Dr. Barnes wants to extrapolate as constant, we already know fluctuates. Now, it turns out there's another, much more sophisticated nail in the coffin. And this, for the nature of this nail, I would refer you to Exodus chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, where there is a reference to the making of bricks by the Israelis when they were kept as slaves in ancient Egypt. The next slide shows what the problem is. When bricks are formed, they carry in them a record of the strength of magnetic field at the time that the brick cooled and hardened. That's a fact. That's an experimental fact that we can test by going out to various places in the world today and making bricks and then checking the residual magnetism. A physicist by the name of Kenneth Miller has published an article in New Scientist last year summarizing this work, and what he's shown is that when the magnetic field strength is taken for various bricks, all of which are from historical tombs about which we have written records where the dates are authentic in ancient Egypt, we discover that the magnetic field has been fluctuating up, down, up, down, up, down, all the way through the recorded history of the Egyptian dynasties. What Dr. Barnes has done is to take 130 years of the measurements at the right and ignore thousands and thousands of experimental data and evidence that show, as you can see very clearly, the field fluctuates. The decrease in the field is really nothing more than the sort of thing that we see right now with the field going up and down. Now, since it has gone up as well as down in the past, one of the things that's sort of fun to think about is what Dr. Barnes would have said if he had measured the last 130 years and discovered that the field was increasing. He might then say, well, the field is going to become as strong as a magnetic star in 1,000 years or something like that, and Dr. Barnes might be saying that the world was coming to an end. On the other hand, this sort of data would disprove that as well. Barnes' method, like all of the other creationist young Earth methods, depends upon ignoring experimental data, I'm afraid, rather than including it. The magnetic field method, which is the best of the creationist young Earth methods, isn't a valid method at all, and I think my colleague Dr. Gish knows that. Now let's look at the next major point of special creation, which is that the recent creation event resulted in the formation of all living things side by side in pretty much their present condition. Now, our knowledge of the past is not based on theory and conjecture. It's based on fact. And these facts are called fossils, and the fossils show us in a most detailed way what some of the organisms of the past were actually like. Ladies and gentlemen, the main point of contention between Dr. Gish and myself is simple, and it concerns something that we can answer with facts, the facts of the fossil record. Did living things appear simultaneously, following a single creation event, as Dr. Gish has said and has written they did? Or did they appear gradually, over millions of years, a few at a time? Now remember, we got these two theories, and we're going to weigh each other against the fact. Side-by-side appearance versus progressive appearance. Let's simply look at the facts and settle the debate right now. Now, the evolutionists would expect the fossil record to look something like this, as we can see in the next slide. Dr. Gish said evolution was fish to gish. It sure is. And this is the prediction that we would have on the basis of the fossil record for evolutionists. He calls this the fish to gish. In my household, we call this the gorilla to Miller. This is essentially what the evolutionists would propose, and I agree with that. We should find fossils in sequence. What he didn't tell you is that his model is gish to gish. The next slide. And he proposes essentially that everything is created side by side in the oldest strata, and as we go up through time, what we should find is everything's the same. Everything's the same all the way along, and the only thing that can happen is we can have some extinction because evolution doesn't occur and because creation was spontaneous. Okay? Now we're going to do what any good scientist would do, and that's look at the fossil record and see how the fossils appear. Next slide. I win. The fossils appear in sequence. They appear one at a time, one after another. That's it. The debate's over. The simultaneous creation, which Dr. Gish predicts, isn't there. It's not in the fossil record. Now, the fossil record looks like evolution. Now, it's even more powerful than that slide maintains, because within each classification, as the next slide shows, for example, this is one that documents the evolution over time of the various classes of fishes. What we have is we show a progressive appearance of fishes. We don't have all fishes appearing zap like a single creation. We have them appearing over time. We don't always know how they evolved. In fact, you might even say we don't know whether they evolved, but the fact is they appear sequentially. They don't appear all at the same time. Now, the fossil record looks like evolution. Now, what does he have to do? He has to do something that he doesn't like to talk about. But his colleague, Dr. Morris, once wrote 500 pages doing exactly what I'm going to say. He has to claim that all organisms, living or extinct, were created in that event, and that there was a flood 6,000 years ago which killed almost everything alive on the planet. In the flood, heavy things sank, light things floated, and the fossils got sorted into a sequence which, darn, the luck just happens to look like evolution. In other words, when we look at a sequence of fossils, it's not really a sequence, we're really looking at something else. Next slide. For example, in the western United States, we find the following species of horse in various geological strata in the earth. The evolutionists said, well, they're there because they lived at different times. Dr. Gish says, well, they didn't evolve into each other because evolution is so silly we don't even want to think about it, but he has to say something else. He also has to say, why are the skulls in that order? And the only thing that they can come up with is to say, well, you see the guy in the bottom, he didn't tread water very well, so he got buried right away in the flood. And the guys in the middle were a little bit better, and the horses at the very top were excellent swimmers, and therefore they wound up at the top. And you know the surprising thing? Every single evolutionary sequence that exists in the dozens of vertebrate classes just happens to get that way because of a differential ability to tread water. Now, this concept is known as flood geology, and it doesn't stand up to the facts. The next slide. Here's another one of those unfortunate sequences where the animals, darn it, got sorted in a sequence that just looks like evolution, and of course it's all because they couldn't tread water the same way. Now, we're going to test the flood, and we're going to test it the way a scientist would. I'm going to say, okay, there's an assumption. There's an isotope of uranium known as U-238, and it's found in seawater. It decays very, very slowly into an isotope of thorium known as thorium-230. Now, thorium is not soluble in seawater, so it comes out of solution right away and winds up on the ocean bottom. Once there, it decays away with a half-life of 77,000 years. Now, if all the sediments in a great region were laid down at the same time, which is what Dr. Gish suggests they were 6,000 years ago, they should all have had the same amount of thorium-230 initially, and only a little bit of it should have decayed away because, it's 77,000 years and it's been only 6,000 years since this flood. On the other hand, if the evolutionist is right, what we should have is a progression of thorium. There should be less as we go deeper, and the reason for that is because those older sediments have had more time to decay away. So we got two predictions. Let's dig down. Let's check. Next slide. Here's the answer. The creationist prediction is straight across. That's the straight line. The evolution prediction is straight down at an angle, that they should be changing with age. And you may not see the experimental data because, darn it, they printed right on top of that dastardly evolution prediction, and that is that these isotopes decrease in half-life as we go farther and farther down. It matches the evolution prediction precisely. Now, things really get worse and worse. There's a kind of a geological formation known as a varve, which exists in places with active plant life. The next slide. Here in Colorado and Wyoming, there's a varve formation known as the Green River. And the Green River varve formation extends for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and it was laid down over 13 million years. There are 26 million alternating layers which look something like this. Now, Dr. Gish has to say that those 26 million layers were laid down in 300 days, and you work that out, that's a layer every second. Now, it gets a little worse than that, because there's a fellow named Paul McGrew at the University of Wyoming has shown that there are fossilized fish scales in the layers of these varves. The scales are banded like trees, and they show whether the fish that possess the scales died in the summer or died in the winter. You know what? All the ones that died in the summer are buried in the light sediment, and all the ones that died in the winter are buried in the dark sediment. The only explanation is the varve formations really did occur a full year at a time. There wasn't a 300-day flood. Instead, we look at records of millions of years of life. Now, this slide shows a similar varve in Australia that was reported by Williams last year in Nature. And what he showed essentially was that there was an 11-year repeat. I'm sorry, did I ask for next? Could you go back one? My apologies. Thanks. There's an 11-year repeat in the varves. Now, according to Dr. Gish, that's not 11 years, that's a 22-second repeat. But let me ask a question. Is there any natural process that we know of that could cause plant life to vary with an 11-year cycle? The answer? The sunspot cycle. These are yearly patterns. Next slide. Now, there's more evidence closer to home. In Wyoming, there is a beautiful area in Yellowstone Park known as Amethyst Mountain, which is just filled with petrified trees. And you can see some pictures of some of them there. The trees were buried by the same sort of volcanic event that is happening, in fact, today at Mount St. Helens. There was a volcano near Yellowstone, and it erupted over a period of time and buried these trees, root systems intact, most of them standing straight up in such a way that they were preserved because of the amount of ash and dust that settled around them. Now, the interesting thing about Amethyst Mountain is shown in the next slide, and that is that when geologists cut into the core of the mountain, what they discovered was that 27 separate fossil forests had grown up in Amethyst Mountain. There had been an eruption all on Mount St. Helens, and just as has happened in Mount St. Helens, the plants come back, the trees sprout again, they grow into the layer, their roots reach down, they begin to form soil as leaves decay. Boom, that volcano goes off again, and we have alternating layers of soil and ash from the volcano. This sort of thing absolutely cannot be explained by a single flood. And you know what? It has to be explained by a single flood by the creationists, because there's evolution in plant life as we go through the layers. So they have to have some mechanism where the flood somehow manages to create order out of disorder and drop alternately soil, ash, and bring those trees along, set them up straight, put them down, and set their roots out. It's just not possible. Ladies and gentlemen, flood geology was abandoned over 150 years ago by geologists, not because it had problems with evolution, but because it couldn't meet the test of the evidence. It couldn't meet the test of truth. Now, where does all of this leave Dr. Gish's creation model? He says that the Earth is 6,000 years old. The evidence says he's wrong by a factor of about 1 million. He says that all living things appeared following a single week-long creation event. But the evidence says they appeared gradually over time. And he says that a single worldwide flood accidentally made the fossil record look like evolution. But the evidence says that the fossil formations of the world were formed gradually. Gradually, I would point out, by catastrophes, because every single one of those layers is a real catastrophe. If you were near Mount St. Helens, it was a catastrophe. So catastrophes clearly are part of the fossil record. But a single worldwide flood, that does not turn out to be in the cards. It doesn't turn out to be in the geology. I want to add as an aside, that doesn't mean that Noah's flood in the Bible isn't an authentic historical event. In fact, there's a lot of geology that suggests it's real, and it really was an historical event that occurred in the area. The only problem is that the geological evidence for the flood being real, my creationist friend would have to dismiss, because it suggests that the evidence for the flood sits upon much older formations of rocks which were formed in the Paleozoic and the other ages many, many millions of years ago. So ironically, my friend from San Diego is in the position of saying that the legitimate geological evidence for Noah's flood has to be discounted because it doesn't fit in with their overall model of forming all the geology of the world in a single shot, in a single flood. Now, as I've just said, these first three postulates of special creation, simultaneous creation, young earth, and single flood, don't meet the test of the evidence. The fourth prediction is that evolution did not occur in the past and can't occur now. In my second statement tonight, I will devote all of my time to establishing that evolution does occur in the fossil record and occurs today. But I will make a prediction, and I'm sorry to have to make it, and that is that Dr. Gish will not defend this model. He will not directly address why the fossil record is sequential. He won't address the evidence for the age of the Earth, and he won't address the evidence for a single flood, accounting for the Earth's geology. Now, he won't decline to do it because he's not up to it. Dr. Gish is clever and bright and articulate, and he's a terrifyingly good debater. He will decline because he knows he can't defend those ideas. The basic doctrines of scientific creation are scientifically indefensible. Now, Dr. Gish is going to have plenty to say, and he'll say it well. But I ask you to listen carefully. He will not defend the model. In fact, he will not even make clear what the model is. He will criticize evolution. He'll argue for the creation of the universe by a creator. And I point out to you that that second argument is theology, and the first argument I'll answer directly in a few minutes. Now, if the scientific doctrines of the creationists are as badly supported as they seem to be, we have to ask ourselves, how did they determine them? Well, Dr. Morris says something about that. He says, quote, "The only way to know with certainty the time of creation, the order of creation, the meaning of creation is for God to tell us these things. Therefore, in every case, we believe that the only legitimate method of reasoning in this sphere is the deductive method. One starts with one assumption or the other and then develops the system to meet his conclusions. He cannot use the inductive method, attempting to build up an historical record on the basis of pieces of evidence he may be able to find in the present world." Ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Dr. Gish comes to his conclusions because he has his conclusions as a matter of faith ahead of time. Does a scientific fact that might contradict that, does that present a problem for Dr. Gish? Next slide.
2 minutes.
Dr. Morris says, as you can see right here, the only Bible-honoring conclusion is that Genesis is the actual historical truth, regardless of any scientific or chronologic problems thereby entailed. Regardless of any scientific problems. In short, in spite of the facts. Now, Federal Judge William Overton recognized this in his written decision in the Arkansas creation trial. He said, and I quote, "The methodology employed by creationists is indicative that their work is not science. A scientific theory must be tentative and always subject to revision and abandonment in light of the facts which are inconsistent with or falsify the theory. A theory that is by its own terms dogmatic, absolutist, and never subject to revision is not a scientific theory. The creationist methods do not take data, weigh it against the opposing scientific data, and thereafter reach their conclusion. Instead, they take the literal wording of the book of Genesis and attempt to provide support for it. My opponent has attempted to pretend tonight that support for the authentic question of creation is the same as support for his set of so-called creation science theories. Therefore, he would like to imply that if you are a Bible-believing Christian or a Jew, you must be for scientific creationism and for against evolution. Nothing could be further from the truth. Although the suggestion that living things were created in a week 10,000 years ago is something science can test and disprove, and indeed it has, the suggestion that this universe and its inhabitants are the creation of a loving creator is not testable or disprovable, and therefore is outside the realm of science. Creation itself is alive and well. I find very powerful reasons to practice the faith that my parents gave me, and to be active in experimental science as well. But we must draw, I think, a critical distinction between creation per se and the outmoded, completely discredited ideas presented in the guise of scientific creationism. What Dr. Gish calls the creationist scheme of natural history fails the critical test of the facts at every turn. It serves neither science, nor religion, nor education to pretend that these ideas, which were discarded nearly 2 centuries ago, have any validity at all.
Time.
30-minute reply time for both speakers.
To reply to some of it. Now, I want to deal with the subject of probability. May we have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. On this slide, we see the ribonuclease molecule. Now, this is a rather small protein. As a matter of fact, it only has 124 amino acids in it. Most proteins have, on the average, about 400 amino acids, and several of them have thousands of amino acids. Now, there are about 20 different kinds of amino acids, and in order to have a molecule with enzymatic activity or some biological activity of some kind, these 20 different amino acids must be arranged in precise order. The only reason that molecule is ribonuclease, very important enzyme in your body, is because those amino acids have been arranged in that precise order. Now, the problem is, how did they get into that precise order in order to give ribonuclease or hemoglobin or human growth hormone or something like that, you see. Now, according to the theory of evolution, what Dr. Miller is telling you, all these things just self-assembled. They just got together somehow and arranged themselves in the right order. Well, now, let's just calculate the probability now that would happen according to the ordinary processes of chemistry and physics, without any organic chemist, without any creator, without any intelligence. They just sort of got themselves together and arranged themselves in that precise order, or nearly that precise order. It has to be pretty close to it. It never would be ribonuclease. Well, there's 20 different kinds, and you can calculate the probability. Well, the first one, 1 out of 20, you see. And to get 2 in the right order, it's 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, 1 out of 400. How about getting 3 in the right order? 1 over 20 times 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, about 1 out of 16,000. What is the probability that you're going to get 124 of those in the right order? Well, I'll tell you what. The number of different ways you can arrange those 124 amino acids, 20 different kinds, is greater than the number of electrons that you could cram into the visible universe. Assuming the universe is billions of light years in radius, cram this entire universe without 1 cubic inch of space left over. How many electrons do you suppose you get in that universe? Less than the number of different ways you can arrange those amino acids. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, if you had amino acids piled to the depth of 2 miles on the entire surface of the Earth, and you were combining those amino acids every second for 5 billion years, there wouldn't be a ghost of a chance that you get 1 single molecule of that particular arrangement. Because the number of different ways you can arrange those amino acids is so enormous that the number of tries that you could make in 5 billion years would be essentially zero. There would be no probability. And if you did, what would you get? 1 single molecule of 1 single protein. But you need billions of tons of hundreds of protein molecules and billions of tons each of hundreds, if not thousands, of DNA and RNA molecules and other very complex molecules to even have a ghost of a chance of getting the origin of life. What is the probability that something like that would happen? Absolutely zero, ladies and gentlemen. Next slide, please. We see a newspaper article that appeared in the Daily Express of London, August the 14th, 1981. It says, 2 skeptical scientists put their heads together and reach an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Who were these 2 scientists? Sir Fred Hoyle, known all of his life as an anti-theist and evolutionist, and Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, astronomer at the University College of Cardiff, a Buddhist atheist all of his life. The article reveals the fact that these two scientists got interested in the subject of the origin of life in biology. And they began to study the problem, and they became aware of the information content of a single-cell organism. Even the most primitive cell that you can imagine, all the information had to be there. The tremendous complexity. And being mathematicians, they calculated the probability that this could have come about spontaneously in 5 billion years here on this earth, making all the assumptions that evolutionists make. Why, their results were astounding. They couldn't believe it. Their results showed there was a zero possibility for that to happen. One chance out of one followed by 40,000 zeros. Ladies and gentlemen, the number of particles in the entire universe is only one followed by 80 zeros. This is a number one followed by 40,000 zeros, absolute zero. And so they said, well, let's recalculate. Let's assume that the universe has 100 billion galaxies. Each galaxy has 100 billion stars, and each star had a planet like the Earth, and the universe is 20 billion years old. Let's recalculate. They recalculated. The answer came out essentially zero. So they said, well, life could not have evolved even anywhere in this universe. And I heard Dr. Wickrama say on the witness stand down in Arkansas, he says, you couldn't get even one single enzyme in 20 billion years by this process. And he quoted Sir Fred Hoyle, who said, the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to believe something like that, if Dr. Miller wants to believe something like that, you just go right ahead and believe it. But don't call it science. It's a fairy tale. It's a myth that grown-ups have concocted to explain his origin without God. There's no possibility that happened. And they concluded, therefore, there must be a God. They had established to their satisfaction that life could not have arisen spontaneously, therefore it had to be created. And they said this was a reluctant conclusion. Wickrama Singh said, I didn't want to believe it. I'm forced by logic to believe it. Now my question is this, ladies and gentlemen. If scientific facts are sufficient to convince two hard-headed atheists, two scientists who are professing atheists, why is that not sufficient to convince one who professes to be a Christian? Why can it convince atheists but does not convince a Christian? I don't know what's wrong with here. I don't know what's wrong with anybody when you look at that sort of evidence. And we need not only refer to Sir Fred Hoyle. What about Hubert Yockey, Dr. Yockey? He's an expert on information science. He's not a Christian, not a creationist. He just approached this problem as a scientist. He made all the assumptions evolutionists made, and he calculated the probability of the spontaneous biogenesis, that is, the spontaneous origin of life by chemistry and physics and other natural processes. He published the results in the Journal of Theoretical Biology. Next slide, please. Here we see the statement by Dr. Hubert P. Yockey, which appeared in Journal of Theoretical Biology, 1977. This is not a creationist organization or journal. I guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, this is a secular scientific journal, Journal of Theoretical Biology. His paper had to pass the referees, you see, and be approved to get published. What does he say? Well, he says, I quote, the longest genome, that is the longest gene which could be expected with 95% confidence in 10 to the 9th years, that's a billion years, in a billion years, corresponds to only 49 amino acids. Residues. This is much too short to code a living system, so evolution to higher forms could not get started. Geological evidence for the warm little pond is missing. It is concluded that belief in currently accepted scenarios of spontaneous biogenesis based on faith, contrary to conventional wisdom. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, what does this man say? Why, in a billion years, all you could get is one single gene coding for one single protein of 49 amino acids. Well, that wouldn't even make one single protein. But you can't have life with one single protein, of course. That's ridiculous. That's light years short of a living cell. So he says you couldn't even get a start to the origin of life. Ladies and gentlemen, again, if this evidence reached out by this scientist is sufficient to convince him that the evolution of life is impossible by natural processes, why isn't it sufficient to convince Dr. Miller? You see, for anyone like that. Thank you. Now another person who is not a Christian, did not come out of the book of Genesis, did not come to the creation position because of some religious position, is that of Dr. H.S. Lipson. He published an article in the Physics Bulletin, Volume 31, 1980. Now, the Physics Bulletin is a publication of the Institute of Physics in Britain. It's a secular scientific journal. Dr. Lipson published this article entitled, "A Physicist Looks at Evolution." Now, Dr. Lipson says here that he became suspicious of evolution theory because it has become a religion, and scientists bend their observations to make them fit. And so he said, I tried to compare the biological evidence of the last 30 years to see if it fit in with Darwin's theory. He says, I don't think that it does. And he compared the thermodynamic evidence to evolution theory and showed the contradiction between the science of thermodynamics and evolution. And then he said, well, maybe we should consider some other alternative theory of evolution. And then he says, and I quote, I think, however, that we must go further than this and admit that the only acceptable explanation is creation. I know this is anathema to physicists, as indeed it is to me, but we must not reject a theory we do not like if the experimental evidence supports it. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, notice what he said. The experimental evidence, scientific evidence, supports creation. He says, I don't like this idea. It goes against my particular personal philosophy. But we must not reject the theory we do not like if the experimental evidence supports it. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if the scientific evidence is sufficient to convince Dr. Lipson, the very concept of creation is anathema to him. What about Dr. Miller? It's not anathema to him. He says he believes in some sort of creation, even if it's evolution. I don't know how evolution is creation, but it certainly is not anathema to his Christian philosophy. Then why isn't this scientific evidence sufficient to convince him, if it convinces people who don't like the idea? Now let's take a look at the science of thermodynamics for just a moment. You see, if evolution is true, if we started with an explosion, and that's certainly got to be chaos. I've never seen an explosion generate order yet. We had to start out as a chaotic state, and this universe, now this chaotic, disordered universe, converted itself into the universe that we have today, which is highly structured, highly ordered, highly complex. Then matter must have some inherent capability, some inherent property that allows it to transform itself from disorder to order, from the simple to the complex. That must be a property inherent in matter if the evolution theory is true. Of course it must be. Everything in this universe is a result of the process of evolution. That's got to be true. On the other hand, if creation is true, if God created this universe, we would ascribe, at least I would, that he created the universe in a perfect state to begin with. It's certainly not perfect now. And we say this, if anything has happened since creation to alter that original created state, it could only bring about disorder. We might have processes now which are going downhill, leading towards disorder. But we would never expect matter to have an ability to transform itself to ever higher and higher levels of order and complexity. What do we find in the real universe? What do we see when we just go out there and take a look? Well, ladies and gentlemen, no scientist has ever detected any inherent property of matter to transform itself from disorder to order. That is not a property of matter. There is no natural law describing such a property of matter. But there is a natural law called the second law of thermodynamics, which states that there is a universal tendency of matter in this universe to go from order to disorder, from the complex to the simple. That is the natural way. Everything in this universe, in the scale of the universe, scale of galaxies, down to our own bodies, machines, and so forth, and down to the level of the atom, do decay with time. Let's see what Asimov had to say about this. Next slide, please. Isaac Asimov, the Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970, said that another way of stating the second law, then, is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain our own bodies and machinery, or how difficult to maintain houses, machinery, and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what the second law is all about. Evolution has a problem. Notice, evolution said everything wound itself up. This universe wound itself up. It created itself. We went from chaos to the cosmos, from order to disorder, or from disorder to order. We went from the simple to the complex. The second law of thermodynamics said, now wait a minute, everywhere in the universe, I don't care whether you call it a law or not, there just aren't any exceptions. Everything tends to go that way. Everything is running down, deteriorating. Now, ladies and gentlemen, really, how is it possible that these natural laws and natural processes that are now operating, and the evolutionist says that's all there is and that's all there ever has been since the origin of this universe, or since the Big Bang, all there ever has been, if those natural laws and natural processes are now leading inexorably to the destruction of this universe, how could those same natural laws and processes have created it in the first place? Now, that's not possible, ladies and gentlemen. You can't have processes that destroy the universe created also in the first place. That's not possible. Now, furthermore, if the second law of thermodynamics says anything, it does say this. If you have an isolated system, that's a system in which no work is being performed by anything on the outside. That's a system into which nothing is being brought in from the outside. And that's what every evolutionist believes, whether he's an atheist or whether he's a theist or what. It doesn't make any difference. God didn't do any work on the universe. It was a natural process. And it wound itself up. It created itself, started in a state of disorder, and transformed itself to this incredibly complex universe that we have today, with these unbelievably complex living things. Ladies and gentlemen, the second law of thermodynamics says that is not possible. That cannot happen. That never happened. If you have an isolated system, that system can go only in one direction, and that's downward. It will deteriorate with time, inevitably. Never, never, never will it go from disorder to order. Never will it increase in order and complexity. Let me say this again, ladies and gentlemen. This universe, according to the evolutionists, is an isolated system. You can't use that old ploy of open and closed systems and so forth to get around this difficulty. This universe is an isolated system according to evolutionary theory. It created itself, and the second law of thermodynamics says that is flatly, totally impossible. Now let's take a look at the fossil record. According to the evolutionary theory, we must have an enormous number of transitional forms, intermediate types. Our museum should be overflowing with them. We have 250,000 different fossil species in our museums right now. 250,000, and millions of fossil species, or fossils of different kinds. Why, we have a tremendous number of fossils. Why, if evolution is true, ladies and gentlemen, we would not be debating here tonight. There'd be no question, there'd be no dispute, there'd be no debate. Nothing like this would be taking place. Evolution would be an established and proven fact. What do we find in the fossil record? Well, the fossil record is so bad and so embarrassing to evolutionists. Dr. Mark Ridley, an evolutionist in New Scientist, June 25th, 1981, realizing that, listen to what he says, no real evolutionist uses the fossil record in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to spatial creation. End of quote. Would you listen to that? No real evolutionist would do that, he says. Well, why is he saying that? Because he knows the problems, he knows the difficulties, he knows the embarrassment that it is to evolutionary theory. So no real evolutionist would do that. Well, we'll see tonight if Dr. Miller uses the fossil record to support evolution. If he does, then he's no real evolutionist, according to Mark Ridley. Dr. David B. Kitts, in the journal Evolution, Volume 28, 1974, has an article in which he's discussing paleontology and evolutionary theory. That is, the fossil record and evolutionary theory. And he's talking about the gaps, the absence of transitional forms, and the problem it poses for evolutionists. Listen to what he says on page 467. Quote, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate points between species, and paleontology does not. provide them. End of quote. What does this evolutionist say? What does this man say who's an expert on the fossil record? He says, although evolution requires intermediate forms, the fossil record does not produce them. There you have it in black and white, ladies and gentlemen, a notorious difficulty for evolutionists. Colin Patterson is a paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. Been an evolutionist all of his life. Wrote a book on evolution. I think it was published in 1978. A friend of mine, after reading this book, wrote to Dr. Patterson. Said, Dr. Patterson, I enjoyed your book. Very nice book on evolution, very well illustrated. He said, however, it would have been helpful if in that book you had provided some examples of actual transitional form. At the very least, perhaps you should have had an artist draw pictures of what you think these transitional forms look like. Dr. Patterson, in the letter dated 10th of April, 1979, wrote back to my friend and replied, and we see that in the next slide, please. Next slide. He says, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Get the information from. I could not honestly provide it. And if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? End of quote. All right, here's an expert on the fossil record, an evolutionist, sitting among one of the greatest collection of fossils in the world. And he says, you're right, I don't have any transitional forms in my book, but if I had known of any, either among these fossils or among the living, I would certainly have included them. Then he says if he included these transitional forms, you see, that would just be, or what some artist's conception, that'd just be artistic license. Ladies and gentlemen, what's wrong here? What's wrong when a scientist has this vast collection of fossils and he can't come up with one single transitional form? You know what? Dr. Patterson gave a talk to the American Museum of Natural History on the 5th of November, 1981, just last year, to a packed audience of evolutionists. He got up before that audience and said that he had woke up about 18 months ago and suddenly realized one morning that he did not need the theory of evolution. He said he now realized he'd duped himself for 20 years in believing that he knew something about evolution, and now he realized he didn't know anything. He said he had moved from science into faith. He said the theory of evolution not only conveys no knowledge, it conveys anti-knowledge. And he gave a number of examples where predictions based upon evolution were contradicted by scientific data, precisely contradicted. It not only conveys no knowledge, he says it conveys anti-knowledge, and he characterized himself as an anti-evolutionist. Then he backed off again and said, well, he just called me a non-evolutionist. A man who's been an evolutionist all of his life and knowing the fossil record as he does. Amazing. Well, that's like Vice President Bush getting up and denouncing the Republican Party. And when Sir Fred Hoyle got up and embraced creation, that's like President Reagan getting up and denouncing the Republican Party. Amazing, tremendous, important changes in thinking among these evolutionists. Next slide, please. We see a statement about the fossil record by Lord Zuckerman. Dr. Solly Zuckerman is professor and was chairman of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham in England for many years. He became Sir Solly Zuckerman, finally Lord Zuckerman, and Lord Zuckerman had a scientific team which spent many years in the search for man's fossil ancestry. Did a tremendous amount of research on Australopithecus and other creatures. He has certainly done his homework. If anyone could be called an expert in this field, he could be called an expert. After all of these years of research, listen to what Lord Zuckerman has to say. In his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, published in 1970, on page 64, we read the following statement, quote, no scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. End of quote. You see what Lord Zuckerman says? He says if we exclude the possibility of creation, if we deny that possibility, then obviously man must have evolved from some ape-like creature. But if he did, he hasn't left a trace of that evolution in the fossil record. There is no evidence in the fossil record that man has evolved from some ape-like creature, according to Lord Zuckerman. Now that's coming from an evolutionist. He's not a creationist. He's not on our side. But that is the considered judgment of this Great scientist. Next slide, please. Now, on this slide, we see what a creature that is known as Australopithecus. And this has been the central figure in man's evolution now for many years. This is Dr. Louis Leakey's Ginjanthropus, and now we have Donald Johansson's Lucy. Now, Johansson says his Lucy is about 2 million years older than this creature. Therefore, Donald Johansson's Lucy should be more primitive. These creatures should be more advanced, because they're supposed to be 2 million years younger than Johansson's creature. Donald Johansson says that his creature is ape from the neck up, has the jaws, the teeth, the brains, and face of an ape, but he says it walked upright. And that's been the consensus on these creatures for many years, that they walked upright. Now he says it's totally ape from the neck up, but it walked upright. Lord Zuckerman, after 15 years of research on these creatures, claims they did not walk upright. They were not intermediate between ape and man. Charles Oxnard, one of his former students, now professor of anthropology at University of Southern California, director of the graduate studies there on that campus, has studied these creatures of postcranial skeleton for many years. He said they did not walk upright like man. They had a mode of locomotion similar to an orang. They were not intermediate between ape and man. They were just apes. But this is ignored, and everybody hears about Johansson and Richard Leakey and those people. But ladies and gentlemen, I think the sound, solid scientific evidence indicates that these were just apes. And I think we should bear in mind the track record of evolutionists in this area in the past. The next slide, please, shows the Piltdown man reconstructed from a few fragments of a jaw and a few fragments of a skull. That was man's ancestor for a half a century. The famous Piltdown man turned out to be a hoax, a fraud. Somebody had taken the jawbone of a modern ape, a human skull, had doctored him up, planted him in the gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. Why could not these authorities identify a modern ape's jaw and a human skull? Because this is what they had expected to find, you see.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2.
2, okay. We get our signals here. In 1922, a single tooth was discovered in western Nebraska, brought to the attention of several of the leading evolutionists of that day, and they were very excited by the discovery of this tooth. It seemed to have several characteristics they'd associate with primitive man and intermediate form. And so they constructed what they called Nebraska man from that tooth, and the Illustrated London News had their artist draw a picture of that creature based upon the description of the scientist, published in 1922. We see that in the next slide. All right, there he is, the Nebraska man, his wife, and the tools that they were using, all based upon that single tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? Well, a few years later, when they found the remainder of the skeleton, Nebraska man turned out to be neither an ape-like man nor a man-like ape. He turned out to be a pig. That's right. It was a pig's tooth, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the point is this. If evolutionists can get something like that from a pig's tooth, then it's no great challenge to get something like that from a fragment of a monkey or an ape. Next slide, please. And here's the Neanderthal man previously portrayed as our subhuman ancestors, all these so-called primitive characteristics. It turned out they were due to pathological conditions, to arthritis, to rickets, or vitamin D deficiency, and so forth and so on. Now he's been upgraded to man. We see him in the next slide, the modern version of Neanderthal man from the American Museum of Natural History. There he is, 100% Homo sapien. And 20 years ago, some scientists published an article in which they said, well, really now, if you just take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath and put him in a business suit, no one would take a second look. That was 20 years ago. Today, you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut. In some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't have to give him a bath. And would you believe, ladies and gentlemen?
Time.
Okay, I'll be back. Thank you.
Excuse me, Dr. Miller for 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. I think you're all aware that Dr. Gish has spent a lot of time talking about the second law of thermodynamics and saying that the universe could not have created itself, and therefore there had to be a creation event to bring the universe into existence. I'm not going to argue with that, so I'll give Dr. Gish a break. There are two reasons I won't argue with that. The first reason is that I agree with Dr. Gish about a creator. And scientifically, I know nothing about whether or not there was a creation event or not, because science can say nothing about the ultimate question of origins. As a matter of faith, as a Christian, I believe in a creator and therefore that there was a creation event. The second reason is that the question really doesn't matter to evolution. Scientifically, evolutionists can't tell whether a creator formed the universe at the time of the Big Bang or if the creator created life on Earth rather than having it evolved or anything else. Now, the reason I do this is not to slip out of the noose. It's rather in the character of science itself. And this is a quote from the opinion of Judge William Overton at the Arkansas creation trial. Quote, "The scientific community does not consider origins of life a part of evolutionary theory. The theory of evolution assumes the existence of life and is directed to an explanation of how life evolved. Evolution does not presuppose the absence of a creator or God." That means that evolution is really the more open-minded of the two models, and the reason for that is that creationists must argue for a creator, but evolutionists can have it either way. Now, no one can say for certain whether or not life would have come from inanimate matter any more than we can say anything scientific about the origin of the universe. The actual origin of the universe is a theological and philosophical problem, and not a scientific one. Now, Dr. Gish made some remarks which were pointedly directed to me, which is to say, if this will convince Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickrama-Singh, why won't it convince Dr. Miller? The funny part about this, you ought to know what Chandra Wickrama-Singh and Fred Hoyle are convinced of. Dr. Gish would like you to believe they're convinced of his action, and what happened was that in Arkansas, the Attorney General thought so too. And he invited Chandra Wickrama-Singh to come and testify in the Arkansas creation trial. So he asked him a lot of questions about, what do you think about evolution? Nonsense. What do you think about the origin of life? Couldn't have happened. Do you think there must have been a creator? There must have been a creator, and so forth and so on. Then, however, he did something silly. And that is that he asked him, what do you think of Dr. Gish's special creation model? And Chandra Wickrama-Singh, the great expert who Dr. Gish showed you his picture and said, here's a God. Do you know what he said about Dr. Gish's model? I wouldn't use this word, but he did. He said, and I quote, "It is claptrap." Absolute nonsense. That's what he said about that model. That's the person that Dr. Gish says, why won't it convince him? Well, the reason it won't convince me is that I'm convinced of the same thing that Hoyle and Wickrama-Singh are, and that is that there's a God. What I'm not convinced of is that special creation happened, and you know what? Neither are Hoyle and Wickrama-Singh the people who Dr. Gish hoped he could bring to his aid. The real issue, and the one that I'm afraid, Dr. Gish, I'm still waiting to hear you address, is descent with modification. The idea that animals and plants today are descended from older forms which are different. There's nothing inconsistent with this belief in creation. It's only inconsistent with the belief that the universe was created recently and that animals and plants have been unchanged since creation. So we should expect Dr. Gish to argue that each of the living things appeared at the same time in pretty much their same condition and have remained unchanged. That's what the debate is about. Now, I hope to be able to do two things tonight. One was to build a case not against creation itself, which is the straw man that Dr. Gish keeps arguing for, but rather against the creation science model, young Earth simultaneous creation worldwide flood. The other goal, which I haven't done yet, was to show that evidence exists for evolution, both in the past and in the present. Now, Dr. Gish has to believe, for reasons we've already discussed, that living things were created 6,000 years ago. I've challenged him directly on that, and I'm waiting for the reply. I challenged him on the flood, and what I'm going to do now is to defend my model and to challenge him on the basis of the fossil record. Now, I want to concentrate on that because it's in the fossil record that we see the most powerful evidence that evolution itself has occurred. The first kind of evidence, the first slide, please, is shown in the sort of thing that we see is, oh, you went back all the way to the beginning. Yeah, oh, excellent, thanks a lot. This is another one of those slides which shows the sequential appearances of forms all the way through the fossil record. The sequential character, the evolutionary biologists call that an orderly succession of fauna, or flora if they study plants, because things appear in a manner that indicates clearly that one level is descended from the next. Dr. Gish says descent never happened. Nonetheless, the fossil record is there, and he's got to say why it looks like evolution. I'm waiting to hear that. Now, we don't have a perfect record of the past. You want proof of that? Dotted lines. We don't know exactly how everything was related to each other. It's not covered up. It's right in the textbook, and that's why the dotted lines are there. We don't know all of the intermediates, but we know quite a few. If every single species that had ever lived had been fossilized, and every single fossil that had ever been formed had been dug up, sort of a strip miner's dream, then we'd have an idea in precise terms of what every single thing in the past was like. And we don't have that because fossilization is a chance occurrence. So we can't tell precisely where every living thing came from. But we can do a good deal with what we have, and we have an awful lot. We have in the museums of the world over 100 million classified and sorted fossil specimens. That's an awful lot of fossils. They cover almost 1 billion years of life, though. And what that means is that if we spread that out, those 100 million fossils, we only have one fossil for the entire Earth for every 100 years. And that's rather a poor sample if you consider how long it would take to get a sample of every species on the planet. It's sort of like being given 5 still photographs of a baseball game, and then being challenged on the basis of those 5 photographs to do a complete 9-inning play-by-play. And that's sort of what Dr. Gish is asking me to do tonight. Nonetheless, we can still tell from those 5 still photographs whether the athletes were playing baseball or, for example, playing football. And I contend that we can tell from the fossils whether the organisms of the past were playing special creation or whether they're playing evolution. And you'll see what I mean. Now, Dr. Gish is extremely bold about the lack of evidence for evolution in the fossil record. For example, he claims that Triceratops, which is one of the most famous of the dinosaurs, appeared without a trace of an ancestor in the fossil record. I want to use his words so you know what he says. Nowhere do we find in-between forms with spikes starting out as little spikes which gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger, finally ending up as a Triceratops dinosaur. The first time you see a dinosaur with an armor plate on its head and with 3 spikes, he's a full-fledged Triceratops with a huge armor plate with 3 big spikes. This is strong evidence for creation. Dinosaurs, those terrible lizards, page 21, on sale outside. Dr. Gish, you owe me for the plug. These are the words of my opponent. But what is the evidence? Does Triceratops really appear without ancestors? Next slide. You can look this up for yourself. This is Psittacosaurus. Psittacosaurus is an organism that existed 45 million years before Triceratops. It's generally known as the parrot lizard. Structurally, it's very closely related, next slide, to another form known as Protoceratops that appeared 25 million years before Triceratops. Protoceratops had a head which was very similar to Triceratops, an armor plate, but the horns, as you can see, were rather reduced. The next slide is an organism which appeared 10 million years later, known as Monoclonius. Monoclonius has 1 major horn and 2 tiny horns right next to its eyes, exactly where the big horns show up on Triceratops. Both of them lived in the same place, North America. And finally, Triceratops. The organism that Dr. Gish says is an orphan with no ancestors. Next slide, Triceratops has, next slide please, is not an orphan. It has lots of ancestors, and we understand precisely how those come together. Now, Dr. Gish tries to get out of this by saying, well, Protoceratops and Monoclonius both appear in the Cretaceous, and if they're the ancestors of Triceratops, they should appear before, and that proves they couldn't be the ancestors. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cretaceous lasted 71 million years, and there is plenty of time for all of these organisms to have existed in the Cretaceous. The ancestors are there. Dr. Gish is wrong, and I challenge him to get up and say, what's the matter with this particular evolutionary sequence, which he has already written does not exist. Now let's take 2 of the creatures which Dr. Gish often says can't be counted as intermediate between 2 major groups. The first of these is an organism known as Archaeopteryx, and the other one is an organism known as Ichthyostega. Next slide, please. This is Archaeopteryx. The fossils of Archaeopteryx are absolutely sensational, and this is a cartoon you can see from the thing that Archaeopteryx is busy contemplating the mysteries of the universe. But what I've done on this reconstruction, and I want to point out, and even Dr. Gish will admit this is not a fanciful reconstruction. We have fossils of Archaeopteryx, and I'll show one later tonight if anyone would like to see it, that are sensational. We can see what the feathers look like and everything, so it's actual fact. What I have done on this is to illustrate those characteristics of Archaeopteryx which are reptilian. Those are in the blue boxes. Those characteristics which are clearly bird-like, and those characteristics which are yellow. Archaeopteryx had one overriding bird characteristic, and that is that it had feathers. But the important thing is that it had dozens of other characteristics which were entirely reptilian. For example, although those feathers were perfectly good, every single modern bird has a specialization which anchors the flight feathers to the bone, which is known as a quill node. There's a bump on the bone which anchors the feathers so that when the bird flaps, those feathers are anchored firmly in place and they don't wobble around. You know what? Archaeopteryx didn't have that. Archaeopteryx looks like a reptile which had evolved feathers. They appear suddenly. Leading evolutionists and leading paleontologists who originally found the skeletons of Archaeopteryx said very clearly, if we had not been lucky enough to get impressions of feathers from the fossils, then on the basis of the skeleton alone, Archaeopteryx would be sitting in the museums today classified as a dinosaur. That's how intermediate it actually is. The next slide. Dr. Gish also takes apart in some of his books Ichthyostega, which is an ancestor which is intermediate in form between fishes and amphibians. And what I've done is the same trick. and that is in red I've illustrated the amphibian characteristics, in blue the fish characteristics, and in yellow the characteristics which are somewhere in between. It's an intermediate form. The main amphibian characteristic of Ichthyostega is that the limb and the shoulder girdle had developed enough to carry the animal about on land. That's what made it an amphibian. That's why we can recognize it. Dr. Gish may say it's 100% amphibian, but it's the most fish-like amphibian that has ever existed, and it appears before any other amphibian. Now, the other thing that Dr. Gish has done in print is to say, well, I don't like that. I want another intermediate. I want an intermediate which links Archaeopteryx with an authentic fish. The next slide shows that there is such an intermediate. The central form is a form which has recently been found, which is intermediate in character between Ichthyostega and the fishes from which it seems to have evolved. Now, I have the devilish suspicion that Dr. Gish is going to say, aha, your problem is worse than it was before. You used to have one gap, you found something in the middle, so now you have two. I think that's characteristic of the sort of reasoning that we have to deal with when we argue in this particular thing. The fact is, in the next slide, that there is a pattern of evolution that extends throughout the vertebrate classes, which is clear and consistent and overwhelming. Now, Dr. Gish may say, I know where you have the arrow there, there's too much of a gap. I want to see what was in the middle. And if you pull the intermediate up, he'll find two more gaps and want something in there and so forth and so on. The fact of the matter is that the sequence does exist. And if Dr. Gish wants to say evolution didn't occur, he's bound to say then why the fossil records appear in this sequence. Let's hear all about the treading water. Let's hear about the sorting out in the flood and so forth and so on. Defend the model if you're going to attack this one, because I'm in the process of defending evolution. Now, I'm going to do something, may I have the lights up, which will be, I think, of interest to each of us. Now, the last time, oh, I'm sorry, leave the lights down. You know how us evolutionists are, we're very flighty. The last time that Dr. Gish and I saw each other was in February, and we had a nice debate at the University of Arizona. The next slide shows sort of what that debate was like. This is Dr. Gish and next slide, please. It's Dr. Gish and myself. Next slide. There we go. That's a little bit more of what it was like. And in that debate, David Milne, who was a colleague of mine, I don't know how that got in there. Dr. David Milne, who's a colleague of mine, challenged Dr. Gish to do something. They have the lights up, and I'll show you what that challenge was. Spotlight's on the stage. This is a reptile, the forelimb of a reptile, which us evolutionists say was the ancestor to birds. Forearm of reptile ancestor. This is what the forearm of a modern bird looks like. Now, there are a great many similarities, as I think you can see from the little cartoon that I've drawn. What has happened, essentially, is that the claw structures which appear in the reptiles have vanished. There's a little bit of a change in the phalanges, the finger area, and, of course, there are feathers. Now, we say that there's a transitional form in between those. Dr. Gish says, well, what you call a transition is, in fact, not transitional. So what I'd like to challenge him to do tonight is to say, okay, if you say we haven't found the intermediate, Dr. Gish, when you have a chance to speak, I'd like you to come up here and draw for us a transitional fossil which, if it was found, would be acceptable to creationists as evidence of evolution. There you have the pen. Now, when Dr. Gish and I debated last time, he didn't do that. He just ignored it the whole night, and I sort of hope that he'll do it tonight. And the main reason I hope we'll do it is because I think we can all have some fun. Because in here I have the mystery fossil, which is the authentic fossil, which we consider to be intermediate between those two forms. And when Dr. Gish draws his, I'll pull this out, and we'll see whether or not there's any evidence for evolution. Okay. Now, in Dr. Gish's own writing, when he tries to dispose of one of the best transitional sequences, the best ones we have, they have the spotlights off, please. Thank you. Which is the reptile to mammal transition. We have a problem in terms of what us evolutionists have to do. The problem is we don't have a single intermediate which links reptiles to mammals. Instead, we have about a dozen. Can I have the spotlights off, please? Thank you. Next slide. This quote from Neville George is indicative of the problem we have in evolution. As you can see, in the Permo-Triassic sequence of fossils, he's talking about the evolution of mammals. The contrasts were established very slowly and only slowly and gradually through groups of intermediates, and became indefinite in early members of the thermomorphs, so that, and this is the important part, quote, what is a mammal and what is not a mammal is pretty much an academic question, and so forth and so on. In other words, the sequence of evolutionary forms we have is so graded and so gradual, it's really hard to tell whether they're reptiles or mammals. I can't imagine a sequence that would be more transitional than one where you had precisely this difficulty. But Dr. Gish says that there's no evidence for evolution. If any of you subscribe to Acts and Facts, A month or two ago, Dr. Gish wrote an article, which I have here with me if you'd like to see it, debunking the reptile to mammal transition and saying there's no evidence for evolution. Now, to me, the curious thing about his writing was that there wasn't a single picture or drawing in the article. Not once did he show what the series that he says isn't evolution really looks like. And you want to know why there's no pictures in the article? The next slide. The reason there are no pictures is because the pictures show all too clearly that evolution really did occur. Here's the area we're looking at. We're looking at the jaw and the middle ear. On the left-hand side, we have the jaw structure of an advanced mammal-like reptile. Mammal-like reptiles have the dentary, which is the major jawbone, and several smaller bones, among them the articular, the quadrate, and the stapes, which in the reptile is sometimes called the columella. In the mammal, these two bones have become detached from the dentary and have, as Dr. Gish has said, moved up into the middle ear where they're used to conduct sound impulses. Now, we ought to see some intermediates linking those, right? Next slide. What the sequence of fossils looks like in terms of quality is documented here. This is Eosostrodon. It's the oldest organism that we begin to call mammalian. The fossils of these are sensationally good. We have all the jaw structure, we can see the whole thing. Eosostrodon is not quite a mammal and not quite a reptile. It's somewhere in between. Next slide. And what the evolutionary sequence looks like is shown here. Now, this is from an article by Allens, and what I've done is to color in the dentary with green and color the other bones in the series with red. Boom, 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 one after another, evolution all the way up. Now, there are two forms in there. Dr. Gish he's going to nail me if he catches me getting away with this. There are two forms in there that weren't real. The one on the bottom is a hypothetical form, and the second one from the bottom is hypothetical, but they're not the important ones. The important ones are near the top. And every single other one is an authentic, guaranteed, 100% well-preserved fossil. They're there, and what they show progressively is an increase in the size of the dentary and a movement of the quadrate and the articular back into the inner ear. Now, how does Dr. Gish deal with that? Because, boy, if that's not evolution, I don't know what is. The next slide. How he deals with it is this. I hope you'll forgive both Dr. Gish and I when we try to read from the screen, because the angle here is really tight. He says another fundamental difference between reptiles and mammals is the fact that all reptiles, living or fossil, have a single bone in the ear, a rod-like bone known as the columella, which connects the eardrum to the tympanum. Friends, the eardrum is the tympanum. I'm not sure what Dr. Gish means by connecting the eardrum to the tympanum. Maybe he can explain. Mammals possess three bones in the ear, the stapes, malleus, and incus, which connect the drum to the tympanum. He may mean the tympanum to the oval window and may have those confused. It's a long time since my colleague studied vertebrate anatomy, and I can understand the problem. Evolutionists maintain that the stapes corresponds to the columella and that the quadrate and articular somehow moved into the ear to become the incus and the malleus. No explanation is given of how the intermediates managed to hear while this was going on. Now, you know how good Dr. Gish is with the joke, and you can imagine him saying, how could it eat? How could it hear? It just doesn't make any sense, and so forth and so on. And it sounds terribly difficult. How could bones down here detach and move up into the middle ear? It sounds very difficult until you look at the pictures. Next slide. And what you will discover in the mammal-like reptile at the left is that the quadrate and the articular don't have to move into the middle ear. They're already there. The tympanum is colored in green. The articular makes contact with it. The quadrate makes contact with it. And the stapes, or the columella, conducts impulses into the oval window, which is near the inner ear on the inside. Exactly the same pattern is preserved in mammals. They don't have to move in the inner ear. They're already there. And I'm not sure why my colleague from San Diego found it necessary to mislead in terms of what the anatomy of the inner ear looks like. But when you look at it, you discover they don't have to move into the middle ear. They're already there. Next slide. Okay, this is a more serious error, I think. As insuperable as this problem appears to be, it pales into relative insignificance when you consider the fact that the essential organ of hearing in the mammal is the organ of Corti, an organ not possessed by a single reptile, nor is there any evidence that would provide even a hint of where this organ came from. Now, we skip a little bit, and he says how wonderful the organ of Corti is. It really is. It's one of the neatest tissues in the body, I guarantee that. But he says it has no, and I quote, no homologue in reptiles. There is no possible structure in the reptile from which it could have been derived. It would have had to have been, note the word, created de novo, since it was entirely new and novel. Is that true? Next slide. Lo and behold, you open a textbook on vertebrate anatomy, and what you discover is that the organ of Corti does have a homologue in reptiles, and we know precisely where it came from. There's an area known as the basilar papilla. This is a typical primitive reptile on the inside. This is an hypothetical. This is an artist's conception. That's a crocodile. And the crocodile has a tissue known as the basilar papillae, and note the writer of the book has written up equals organ of Corti, because it's precisely the same in cell structure and function to the organ of Corti. Do you know why it's not called the organ of Corti? Corti was a mammalian physiologist. He only dissected mammals, and he only put his name on this one. At the cellular level, they're exactly the same, and the only major difference as regards the organ of Corti is that the cochlea in the reptile is straight, and the cochlea in the mammal is coiled. Now, I'll be glad to give Dr. Gish the opportunity to respond to that when he finally gets a chance to speak, but I don't understand why the error is so serious and so significant. Ladies and gentlemen, the case is almost complete. The fossil record documents evolution. It defies attempts to say otherwise. It proves the case. Now, there's really only one more task left, and that's to explain the punctuated equilibrium model of Gould and Eldridge. Now, the reason I have to do that is nearly all of the quotes that Dr. Gish pulled out in saying that the fossil record doesn't show intermediate forms come from this particular new school of evolutionary thought. And I'll explain essentially what that is in the next slide. For example, this may be Dr. Gish's cosmic chicken, I'm not sure. The punctuated equilibrium model was originally sort of fathered by Richard Goldschmidt, who was a geneticist who worked at Yale in the 1940s, a long time ago. And he said something funny like a reptile laid an egg and a bird got born, which is a quote that was widely remembered. So Dr. Gish may like to say, well, those evolutionists, they're so desperate, they have to imagine birds coming out of reptiles, and perhaps Papa Reptile would be surprised and would sue Mama Reptile for divorce, and so forth and so on. Is that an authentic characterization of the hopeful monster mechanism or punctuated equilibrium? Not at all. Next slide. Be aware that the quotes saying that there's no evidence for Darwinian change, no evidence for slow and gradual change, will refer to the following phenomenon if my colleague produces them. And that is that as we go through time, in the fossil series, we might expect in the neo-Darwinian fashion that a feature, for example, the length of a bone, would get gradually and slowly longer and longer and longer, so we have an infinite variety of intermediates. Instead, Stephen Gould and Niles Eldridge and many other people argue that what the fossil record really looks like is shown in the bottom slide. Now, there's still evolution, but what happens is we have a whole set of bones of a particular length, let's say 11 centimeters, and all of a sudden, bingo, we have bones that are 13 centimeters in length, and we have a lot of them, and then all of a sudden, whap, we have some that are 20, and we have not a graded series of intermediates between them. We still have evolution, and we can still recognize the path of evolution. Next slide. Now, what you next want to show is how this corresponds to things in the fossil record. For example, in the evolution of the horse, we have a wide variety of species, which really confused people because we originally tried to put them in a single evolutionary sequence, and it's clear that they're in a bush of perhaps 3 or 4. And the point they want to make, and these are where quotes will come, saying there are no intermediates in the fossil record, and Dr. Gish has already used such quotes, is that there are no intermediates between these species. The species itself, for example, Mesohippus, is itself intermediate between Hyracotherium and Hypohippus, so there are lots of intermediates, but there's not a continual series of intermediates. And the next slide is a slide that simply shows how these forms progress as we go through the fossil record. There is not continual variation, there's variation from one type to another. So the progression jumps, or it saltates. It's saltatory, or jumping evolution. Next slide. Now, the first point to make is that seeing discontinuous evolution is not evidence for Dr. Gish's version of creation. Here's what his version of creation would predict the fossil record has to look like. And that is that all these horses, for example, should appear at the same time. They should be found all the way through the fossil record up to a point where they become extinct, and the only thing that's around is a modern horse, and furthermore, the modern horse should go all the way back. Nothing should ever appear suddenly. In fact, the fossil record is filled with sudden appearances, and that contradicts the model. Next slide. Now, the next thing you want to know is, okay, you guys have this jumping evolution. That's a lot of nonsense, isn't it? Genetic change never happens that way. That's a flight of imagination. That's the desperation of evolutionists. It's not so. Here, for example, is a series of mutations which takes Drosophila and changes it from a 2-winged fly into a 4-winged fly. Now, we don't get halfway wings. We don't get little bitty wings growing up. Whap! There's the extra set of wings. That fly gets around just fine. It's quite happy. It can flap all the wings, and it can even fly. The fact of the matter is that this is discontinuous change. The wings don't appear slowly and gradually. They appear suddenly, not because they were created, but because in this system, for this character, that's the way genetics works. And this is one of those accidents that Dr. Gish says, oh, it just couldn't have happened. The next slide shows another similar accident. This is a mutation in sheep known as ancon. If you grew up on a farm, as my father did, you would know that Ancon sheep are very useful for one particular reason, and that is that their legs are so short, and sheep can be terrible if you've ever dealt with them, that the little buggers can't jump over fences, and that makes it very useful to hang on to them. Now, the interesting thing is that there's no intermediate between the Ancon sheep and the normal sheep. They go, and in one mutation, they get a lot shorter. Does this correspond to anything in the fossil record? Next slide. It certainly does. One of the gaps in the fossil record is a gap between two species of rhinoceros, where we see exactly the same kind of change in leg structure that the Ancon mutation gives. The facts of experimental genetics that we can see right now summarize this. They support it, and they work very nicely. The next slide. The mechanism that we see, therefore, is on top a creationist caricature of punctuated equilibrium, a distortion, which says that reptiles must change into birds because evolutionists are desperate in the fossil record. The fact is that what we're talking about is a change which is quite within the realm. One sheep to another, a two-winged fly to a four-winged fly, what is actually authentically observed in testable experiments in the laboratory. The next slide shows, if Dr. Gish would like to quote Stephen Jay Gould, what Steve Gould really says about his model and the gaps in the fossil record. Since we propose punctuated equilibria to explain evolutionary trends, it is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists, whether through design or sorry about that, I do not know. Steve is a little coarser than I am, as admitting that the fossil record includes no transitional forms. Transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level for the reasons we've talked about, but Steve Gould, the foremost evolutionary theorist in the world, says transitional forms are abundant between larger groups. I occasionally agree with Stephen Gould, even though he's a Yankees fan. The fossil record of the past documents evolution. I'm for the Red Sox, sorry about that. It gives us more intermediates than you can shake a stick at. And the kinds of genetic change demanded by the fossil record are exactly what we see in the lab today. Now, it's frequently said that evolution cannot be shown to occur today. That's not true. Many of you own dogs. My wife and I raise golden retrievers, and we lost 2 puppies from our last litter to a virus disease known as parvo. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of parvo, and if you haven't, by all means, go home and have your pet immunized against it. Parvo is a new disease. It appeared only about 5 years ago. We know that it's new, and there was no trace of it prior to 5 years ago. This has been checked at Cornell University Veterinary Medical Center by testing frozen serum samples taken from dogs as long ago as 30 years. There is no reaction to parvovirus in any dog prior to 5 years ago. It's a new disease, and now it's common. Now, where'd it come from? You got 2 choices. One is you could decide that the creator is not inordinately fond of puppies, and he decided to make a new disease to wipe some of those little devils out. A scientist would say, let's look what other organism parvo is similar to and see if it could have evolved from it. It turns out that parvo is almost identical to a species of virus which attacks cats and causes actually a relatively mild respiratory infection.
2 minutes.
It looks as though parvo was produced by what we call a host range mutation, which means that it has undergone a change, an accident, in one of its coat proteins, which just by chance enabled it to attach to proteins on the surfaces of dog cells and produced a dog virus out of a cat virus. Parvo was produced by evolution. The evidence of evolution is all around us. Now, the fossil record is rich with such examples. Let me have the next slide. The fact is that there is an incredibly well-detailed sequence of evolutionary forms, of transitional forms, which illustrates in every detail the evolution of both species, the African and the Indian of modern elephant, and also of the mammoth, the extinct species of elephant. We have that, we've got it all. Next slide. There was a beast known as Titanotherus who roamed the plains of North America millions of years ago. He was one mean guy. He's at the top. He evolved through a series of intermediates that we have in excellent fossils. You can even see the horn beginning to appear and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, evolution has even occurred where Dr. Gish makes his best jokes. Next slide. Now, my wife is an artist, and I knew about Dr. Gish's slide, so I wanted to draw the intermediate between a whale and a cow that Dr. Gish drew before, and she made this nice slide for me before I came. If you'd like to use this, you can. I think it's a really good drawing, and it's a lot of fun, and it looks very silly. But when you retire from comedy and decide you want to do science, you say, okay, what do the real fossils look like? Next slide. What does a fossil whale look like? On the top is Zeuglodon. He's a fossil whale. You know what? Zeuglodon doesn't have his nose in the top of his head the way modern whales do. He has it in the front. Next slide. There is, in fact, an evolutionary trend from terrestrial vertebrates on the left to Zeuglodon to modern whales on the right, which shows slowly and gradually how the blowhole evolved in modern whales. And the next slide shows how these forms look like, what the record is. You don't want to make a joke. You can deal with the facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have an intermission for just 5 minutes. We will have rebuttal for 15 minutes on each speaker when we get back. We'd appreciate it if you would pass the questions that you may have written to the ushers during the intermission. Thank you, and in 5 minutes we'll get back. Rebuttal of 5 minutes each. And then there will be probably about 20 minutes of questions and answers. And then that will conclude the program. So we will now start with the rebuttal, and Dr. Gish will give the first rebuttal, 15 minutes.
Well, with the tremendous amount of material that's been presented here tonight, of course I can only reply to a small portion of it. But I do want to point out the fact, and I reiterate the fact, that there are many evolutionists themselves, that say there's no evidence in the fossil record for transitional form. And Derek Ager, and I quoted some of them, Derek Ager is an evolutionist. And he said in an article published in the Nature of the Fossil, the Nature of the Fossil Record, published in the Proceedings Geological Association in 1976, this British scientist, this British evolutionist said, quote, "It must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked. Similarly, my own experience of more than 20 years looking for evolutionary lineages among the Mesozoic brachiopoda has proved them equally elusive." End of quote. You see what this man is saying? You learn these evolutionary stories just as Dr. Miller is telling you here tonight. And in another generation, they've all been debunked. But in the meantime, that generation, which is debunking these stories of the past generation, are generating their own, which will be debunked by the next generation while they generate their own. And so there's an unending series of these evolutionary stories, and I could describe many of them. What about the Triceratops? Well, let's have that next slide, please. And Dr. Miller has challenged me on this Triceratops. He said the Protoceratops appeared in the Cretaceous, as does its Triceratops, and I said it could not be the ancestor, but that's supposed to be 70 million years long. I'll tell you what's wrong with that story. The Protoceratops, which is supposed to be the ancestor of Triceratops, appears in the Upper Cretaceous, the Late Cretaceous, the end of the Cretaceous. That's when the dinosaurs are supposed to become extinct. That's when he appears. If he was the ancestor, he'd be down in the Early Cretaceous, or perhaps down in the Jurassic or someplace like that. But he does not appear where he's supposed to be. And I don't know where they get these things with those little things on them, because I have pictures of Triceratops, and there are no or the Protoceratops, and there's no incipient horns on that thing at all. And I have a book called the Encyclopedia of Dinosaurs, and I find no such thing in that Encyclopedia of Dinosaurs. That's the Cambrian. Let's go on quickly. All right, here is the fish to the amphibian. Now, Dr. Miller is trying to claim that amphibian is a transitional form. All right, look at those two creatures. What do you see? You see a fish. 100% fish, marvelously designed for life in the water. What do you see in that lower portion of the slide? You see an amphibian with feet and legs. All right, there's millions of years of evolution in between and not a single transitional form. Now that is strange if evolution has occurred. And what about this evolution of the reptile to mammal? Dr. Miller has told you that that transitional form already has those bones in the ear, and that is a lot of nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. That is not true. Morcanucodon, Cuneotherium, the so-called transitional forms, has 6 bones in the jaw. They have a powerful, fully functional reptilian jaw joint. Those bones are not up in the ear, they're down there in the jaw. If that reptile, that creature, has a fully functional, powerful jaw joint, reptilian jaw joint, how in the world can those bones be up in the ear? Ladies and gentlemen, the 3 bones in the mammalian ear are marvelously designed, wonderfully engineered for the function which they perform. You can't take 2 bones from the jaw and stick them up in the ear and have them function. That's a lot of nonsense. And furthermore, that picture he showed of the organ corti, there's nothing on there about the organ of corti. I've read much about the organ of corti. I have never seen in any book on evolution anything, any explanation about where the organ of corti came from. And this homology, supposedly, if you want my frank opinion, is a lot of bunk. There's nothing to it. There is no homology. And I have read books by excellent paleontologists and experts on anatomy says there is no homologue in reptiles. There's nothing from that organ of Corti could be derived. The organ of Corti is the essential organ of hearing in the mammalian ear. It's not found in the reptile. Now you see what supposedly happened? You have a fully functional reptilian jaw, and somehow two of those bones move up into the ear and get re-engineered and redesigned for function in the mammalian ear. At the same time, the organ of Corti appears out of nowhere. And it is marvelous. Listen, the organ of Corti is an incredibly complex structure with thousands of units and so forth. And to think that thing just, to think it is just generated by mistake, it takes a tremendous imagination and a tremendous faith to believe that, a lot more faith than it does to believe in creation. Now, Dr. Miller said that Gould said, Stephen Jay Gould, this big professor at Harvard University, oh, we have plenty of transitional forms between the higher categories, but we just don't have transitional forms between species. Well, I have read enough of Gould's work to know that he knows better than that. And furthermore, George Gaylord Simpson, the dean of American paleontology, the dean of the evolutionists, says precisely the opposite. George Gaylord Simpson says that gaps between species are sporadic and often small, but gaps between the higher categories, the orders, classes, and phyla, the major types, are systematic and almost always large. So you see, Gould, in saying what he said, directly contradicted George Gaylord Simpson. Now, who is right? Well, we don't have transitional forms between these major types. Did you notice the slide that Dr. Miller showed of the origin of all these different classes of animals? Did you note all the dotted lines? All the dotted lines connecting all of those groups, they were all connected by dotted lines. There are no transitional forms. And notice how simultaneously they appear in the record. Gerald T. Todd of UCLA published an article in Abstracts American Zoology, 1980. He's talking about the three major types of fishes, the three major types of bony fishes. He says they all appear suddenly, simultaneously, complete, and they are very different from one another. Listen to what he says. All three subdivisions of the bony fishes first appear in the fossil record at approximately the same time. They are already widely divergent morphologically, and they are heavily armored. How did they originate? What allowed them to diverge so widely? How did they all come to have heavy armor? And why is there no trace of earlier intermediate forms? Why is there no trace of earlier intermediate forms? Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, why isn't there? Why do fishes suddenly appear fully formed, complete, with no intermediate form? Supposedly they evolved from the Cambrian animals, which we had on the previous slide. Some invertebrate of some kind, maybe a jellyfish, maybe a worm, maybe a brachiopod, maybe a cockroach, something like that, evolved into a vertebrate or a fish. 100 million years supposedly involved, and not one single transitional form. Not one, ladies and gentlemen. How can that be? 100 million years of evolution. Billions times billions of those things would have lived and died. Surely our museums would be overflowing with those things, and they cannot produce one such single transitional form. Not one. Now, let me reply to, well, let's have the next slide, please, quickly. Well, there's the Triceratops. There he is. And suppose he came from a Protoceratops. That Protoceratops had no horns. He had a sort of a horny sheath, something like that, and supposedly evolved in this creature with that heavy armor and so forth. No intermediates are found. Next slide. And we see the Stegosaurus with spikes on the tail, plates on the back. Next slide, please. And these very unusual spikes. And the next slide shows the Trachodon. There's a dinosaur standing 18 feet high with duck bill. Many, many different kind of duck-billed dinosaurs, supposedly the jaws and teeth evolved into a duck-bill. Ladies and gentlemen, not one single transitional form, nothing like that has ever been found. How can all that evolution of jaws and teeth into duck-bills occur without a single transitional form? It's incredible. Next slide, please. Oh, that's my picture of my grandson. I don't know how that got in there. Next slide, please. And the Plotagus, a 100-foot-long dinosaur. The next slide, please. And the brontosaurus, 80 feet long, weighing 40 tons. The next slide, the brachiosaurus, standing 50 feet high, with the nostrils and a bony dome on the top of the head. Ladies and gentlemen, all of those have appeared without a single transitional form. Next slide, please. And the bat, here's a flying mammal, ladies and gentlemen, supposedly evolved from a land mammal during many millions of years of time. There's the world's oldest known fossil bat. What is he? 100% bat. The bat suddenly appears, fully formed, no transitional form, and incidentally, no change since he first appeared upon this earth. Next slide, please. And there's the Archaeopteryx. So that's supposed to be nothing but a reptile with feathers. Now, did you ever see a reptile that all you had to do is stick a bunch of feathers in it, kick it in the tail, and it flies? There isn't any such creature. Archaeopteryx had wings. He had perching feet, a bird-like skull. He had feathers identical to the feathers of modern birds. Ladies and gentlemen, I've seen that statement in the scientific literature repeatedly. He had feathers identical to the feathers of modern birds. Not only that, they were feathers of flying birds, not non-flying birds. That bird flew. He was a bird. He stands in marvelous isolation. There is nothing between that bird and any reptile, or between that bird and any other bird. What does Stephen Jay Gould say about this bird? I don't care whether he likes my quoting him or not. Here's the fact that he has stated in Paleobiology, Volume 3, 1977, on page 147, Gould and Niles Eldridge state, and I quote, "At the higher level of evolutionary transition between basic morphological designs, that is, at the higher level between these basically different types of organisms, gradualism has always been in trouble, though it remains the official position of most Western evolutionists." All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, you heard Dr. Miller say that Dr. Gould said, oh, between the higher categories, no problem, we've got lots of transitional forms. What does Gould actually say in the scientific literature? At the higher level of evolutionary transition between these basically different types of organisms, gradualism has always been in trouble. The idea of gradual change. Why, if we got all these transitional forms, gradualism is well established. Then he goes on to say, smooth intermediates between Bauplana, German word meaning these basic different types, smooth intermediates between Bauplana are almost impossible to construct even in thought experiments. There is certainly no evidence for them in the fossil record. Parenthesis, curious mosaics like Archaeopteryx do not count. Parenthesis. All right, what is Gould saying? He's saying you can't even imagine, even in thought experiments, a smooth series of intermediates between anything. Now, Dr. Miller has challenged me to go over there and draw a picture of the intermediates for a bird. Well, I can't do that. I couldn't even do it in my imagination. I can't imagine what in the world would be running around on the ground and be functional and competing with everything else and on its way to becoming a bird. It still can't fly or anything like that. I couldn't do that. And Stephen Jay Gould says he couldn't do it either. And he says it's certainly not part of the fossil record, and Archaeopteryx doesn't count. It's a curious mosaic, like duck-billed platypus, I suppose. Nobody knows what to do with a duck-billed platypus.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
How much?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay.
2 minutes.
All right. Now, I wish I had much more time to say. Now, about the flood, well, ladies and gentlemen, I will say this. Immanuel Velikovsky was an atheist. He's dead now. He was an atheist, an evolutionist. He believed in the worldwide flood. He believed in the flood of Noah. Now, if he thought there was evidence that convincing, and he was an atheist, I don't know what's wrong with the rest of us who call ourselves Christians. Now, furthermore, geologists suppose, they have said, many geologists have said, that the major geological features on Mars were formed by a mammoth flood. But they deny there ever was a worldwide flood on the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, we got 350 million cubic miles of water on the earth and not one drop of water on Mars. And they would believe there was a great flood on Mars with not one drop of water and 350 million cubic miles of water here on the earth. I don't know what kind of thinking that is. Why, we have massive fossil graveyards. We have the Tibetan Plateau, 750,000 square miles of sediment piled a mile deep or greater. What combination of local floodplains would give such a massive deposit? And we have many other evidences for this vast flood. And furthermore, this geological column, which Dr. Miller is using for evidence for evolution, was constructed before 1840, 20 years before the publication of Darwin's book, and it was constructed by geologists who were all creationists, ladies and gentlemen. How could the geological column, and that's practically the only thing that Dr. Miller has presented here tonight to support his theory of evolution, how could the geological column support evolution or prove evolution when the geological column was constructed by creationists?
Time.
Oh, indeed.
Time.
Thank you.
Dr. Miller for a 15-minute rebuttal.
First of all, I want to say how much fun I'm having. I really enjoy getting up and discussing these sort of things and discussing what the evidence is behind the theory of evolution and trying to see what elements of creation make sense and what elements don't. Now, I think the last point that Dr. Gish made, I thought was one of the most interesting. How could the geological column have been constructed by creationists? Because it was constructed before evolutionary theory was written. And first of all, that's historical. It's absolutely correct. The point is that the existence of the geological column and finding the fossils in the distribution that I've talked about convinced the geologists that a single creation event was not, it simply couldn't explain the living universe. For example, the most famous creationist geologist was Cuvier. Cuvier was a creationist. He was a bitter opponent of Charles Darwin. There's no question about that. He said evolution was impossible, it didn't happen. Nonetheless, he realized exactly the point that I have been emphasizing tonight, and that is that the fossil record shows a sequential appearance of forms. Cuvier realized this before Darwin ever got on the scene, or before Marx ever got on the scene, or any one of those other bad guys. What Cuvier realized was that the only way to explain the geological column in the fossil record was what he called progressive creation followed by great catastrophes. And Cuvier postulated as many as 6 separate periods of creation, spread, he realized, over millions and millions of years, as being the only way in desperation that creation could account for the fossil record. He, therefore, was on my side, because he said the fossil record doesn't show simultaneous creation. Dr. Gish says it does, and therefore he has to argue with all of those creationist geologists. Now, there's nothing worse, I think, than getting caught with your facts down. This is an article from Science, December 1978, volume 202, page 1249. It's called The Spokane Flood Controversy and the Martian Outflow Channels. Perhaps the most significant result of the Mariner 9 and Viking missions to Mars was the realization that the fluvial processes on Mars may have shaped portions of the Martian surface. And it goes on to talk about the possibility that the Martian topology, Mars is dry now, was shaped by catastrophic floods. The emphasis is on the word floods because it's plural. It's evident that catastrophic features like floods have shaped a lot of the Martian surface. Now, the second word in this article was the Spokane. Spokane isn't on Mars, no matter what you think about the state of Washington. It's up there in the northwest. This article argues by Victor R. Baker, and it's a widely accepted hypothesis now, that many of the features in the alluvial plains around Spokane were formed by a catastrophic flood. Catastrophic floods have probably happened on Mars. They definitely happened near Spokane. They've happened in many places in historical times, and they may have accounted for the observations of Noah. The issue isn't whether or not catastrophic floods happened. They happened on Mars. They happened on the Earth. The issue is whether every single aspect of the fossil record, that's the key, every single aspect of the fossil record could be explained by sorting out in a big flood. And as I tried to explain in my opening presentation, it couldn't happen. Now, Mr. Darlington, could you put on the first carousel? I'm sorry, I will come back to this one, but could you, I know that's the one I gave you, but could you remove it, I'm sorry, and put on the first one that I brought tonight? Now, pardon me? Now, the second area where Dr. Gish, and I feel bad for him about this, about getting caught with his facts down, has to do with monoclonius. He said, there's no evidence of incipient horns. I scoured the literature. I have here a standard text on the dinosaur published by John Wiley and Sons in 1970. It talks about monoclonius. Monoclonius is a direct descendant of that primitive genus, and it's talking about another genus that monoclonius descended from. For it has a prominent and straight horn on the nose. but the horn over each eye is incipient. Where'd I get it from? I got it from the observations. Is this reconstructing? Is this hypothesis? Monoclonius is known by a complete skeleton about 17 feet long. Could you spin that to slide 29, please? Now, one of the aspects of a good scientist is you always go on learning things, and I hope that Dr. Gish tonight will have learned that Monoclonius had 2 incipient horns, and the horns appeared in the same place as the large horns did in Triceratops, and that's a fact. And like I said, it's very embarrassing to be caught that way. Number 29, please. But when you're caught, you're caught. Gotcha. Now, the other thing is the accusation that because they both occur in the late Cretaceous or the upper Cretaceous, one couldn't be the antecedent of the other. There it is, and there are its incipient horns. They're real, and it's a complete skeleton, not a reconstructed one. Now, the next point was they're both in the late Cretaceous, so one couldn't be the ancestor of the other. Nonsense. The late Cretaceous, ladies and gentlemen, is about 15 million years. It's not like the last period before school gets out. It's an enormous period of time, and it's perfectly possible for those horns to get longer and Monoclonius to get about 2 feet larger, and that's exactly what the difference between Monoclonius and Triceratops is. Slide 44, if you would, Mr. Arlington. Now, Dr. Gish said he's never seen a textbook of physiology where it's indicated that the organ of Corti has any homologue among the reptiles, and there's no indication of where it came from. Well, he's 1 out of 2, and I'll explain why that is. If you would, slide 44, please. Oh, it is. Oh, it is. Okay, sorry, 45. Okay, this is Torrey's standard textbook on vertebrate physiology. Torrey's standard textbook. It's the most widely used textbook on vertebrate physiology in the United States. And what you see is he writes in there, basilar papilla equals organ of Corti. And that's not a fossil, that's from a crocodile. And if a crocodile isn't a reptile, I don't know what is. And I hope Dr. Gish will have the good grace to say he stands corrected and go on with a little better grasp of the facts. The facts are right up there. It's cellularly equivalent to the organ of Corti. Now, Dr. Gish, after the incorrect statement, made a correct one, and I want to affirm that. And that is that we have no idea where the organ of Corti came from in the fossil record. It's absolutely true. Do you know why? The organ of Corti isn't a bone. It's soft tissue. And the only thing we have in these fossils is bone. We don't have any idea where the organ of Corti comes from because the organ of Corti can't be seen in fossil organisms. It only shows up in organisms today. So that's a correct statement, but it has very little import on whether or not the organ of Corti actually evolved. We can look at living organisms and we can see close relatives in those reptiles which are advanced. And that's exactly and precisely what the crocodile is. Okay. Now, I'm sorry, Mr. Darlington, I've run out of quarters, but could you take the slide off and put on the other carousel now? I'm sorry about that. Now, to my mind, Dr. Gish had a large set of what I thought were really very impressive calculations, saying by Hubert P. Yockey and a bunch of other people that evolution of I think he said a protein molecule was absolutely impossible. Now, it's important to understand, and Dr. Gish has not been active in biochemistry for about 15 years, and I think it's a very understandable error to make. Dr. Gish assumes in that calculation, in fact, he showed you the whole sequence, that if you have ribonuclease, you have to have every single amino acid in precisely the right position. So your probability, if you have a protein with 100 amino acids, is 20 to the 100th power of getting it. And I agree that's a very, very large number. In the last 10 or 15 years, though, we've been able to sequence proteins completely, and we found out some relatively important things, and I hope Dr. Gish will find this interesting. The first important thing is that not every amino acid in the protein has to be in the right position. In fact, most of them don't. For example, there's a set of proteins, calmodulin is one of the most important ones, which binds calcium. Calmodulin, for example, has almost 200 amino acids. It turns out that in the functional domain, and what that means in protein jargon is where it's all happening, in the active site, there are only 30 amino acids. It doesn't make any difference what the other 200 are. In that 30, Dr. Gish would say the probability of chance assembly is 1 in 30 to the 20th power, which is a probability of 1 chance in 9 times 10 to the 40th. And I'll go the mile with you and I'll say, you're right, that would be impossible. But let's look at the facts. There are lots of calcium-binding proteins, and we can compare them in different species. Only 2, count them, friends, only 2 of those amino acids always have to be the same in every one we have. For 15 of the 30 ones in the active site, any Any of the 20 amino acids will do. For 8 of them, any amino acid out of 5. For 3, any amino acid out of 7. And for 2, any amino acid out of just 2. When you recalculate the real probabilities, what you discover is the chance isn't 1 in 9 times 10 to the 40th, it's 1 in 16.4 times 10 to the 12th. The difference between that is 10 to the 28th power, which is an enormously large number. That is the fudge factor, which has gone into Dr. Gish's calculations to make the evolution of proteins look so impossible. But ladies and gentlemen, when you look at the facts, when you see what's going on up there, the fact is that it's highly probable. 1 chance in 10 to the 12th, how big a chance is that? A single gram of hydrogen, a gram of hydrogen, a gram of water is about 30 drops, contains 6 times 10 to the 23rd atoms. Against the enormous number of atoms in the entire ocean, a chance of 1 in 10 to the 12th is something that becomes highly probable. I did a calculation at the table and estimated the number of liters of water in the ocean, which comes to about 10 to the 17th. I estimated the chance of a single peptide bond forming at 1 chance in a million. Maybe 1 molecule could bond in a million liters of water. What does the probability come out to when we calculate this for the formation of a calcium binding domain in a protein? The answer is that given the entire ocean and only 1 chance in a million of a single bond forming, with the real probability, a functional one would form every 2 seconds. The fudge factors come out very different. Now, I'm certainly not going to claim that we can prove that life evolved that way. But the point I wanted to make is that the calculations designed to prove it absolutely couldn't are fudged in a most spectacular way. Next slide. Now, I hope Dr. Gish wouldn't take that personally, because I don't mean he fudged in the sense that he cheated, but in the sense that he assumed that proteins are invariant in every single amino acid, and that is just not true. Okay, Dr. Gish also said the second law of thermodynamics forbids evolution. Does it? Not at all. Here, for example, is the illustration from Leninger, a standard textbook on chemical thermodynamics. And what does he say? You see that little circle there? That says the system. Notice something funny about that. He says entropy, and that's the measure of disorder, may increase, stay constant, or decrease. In other words, he says that in a system which is in equilibrium with its surroundings, and that's what the Earth is as we sit here in space, entropy may decrease. That means order may grow. Dr. Gish said, and I quote as approximately as I can, that no physicist or no scientist has ever defined or identified a process which led to an increase in order. Let me have the next slide. There's a process which leads to an increase in order. It's called a storm. It happens spontaneously, without a plan, simply by the virtue of the uneven heating of the Earth. Have physicists define such a process? You bet they have. Now, I showed you this one first because in Florida, I knew you'd all know what a storm looked like. I thought the next object might be unfamiliar. Next slide. But this is what I left when I left New England. We got a lot of these. I had a couple of trillion of those on my driveway yesterday morning. The fact of the matter is that the formation of a snowflake represents and I know a snowflake isn't alive, but it represents precisely what Dr. Gish said no physicist had ever identified, which is a spontaneous increase in order. That's not true. There it is. There are the facts. You may have noticed a style in the way that Dr. Gish and I have argued. He has argued extensively from quotations. I have preferred to show the fossils, to show the inner ear, rather than to assert that something could move. And I wanted to show you where it really was, because I wanted to deal with the facts directly. But I'll take a shot out of his book, and I'll argue from a quote. Next slide. This is Isaac Asimov. Now, he makes some extensive and some rather nasty comments about the creationist interpretation of the second law as being comparable to a certain grade level in school, which I won't repeat. But what he says is that evolution can proceed and build up the complex from the simple, thus moving uphill without violating the second law, as long as another interlocking part of the system, the sun, which delivers energy to the Earth continually, moves downhill at a rate much faster than evolution moves uphill. There it is.
2 minutes, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Next slide, please. Now, Dr. Gish had a lot of fun with Nebraska man. He said evolutionists made a complete organism out of a single tooth. Nebraska man was a bad joke that was only accepted by 2, I think, not very promising anthropologists from Nebraska who rather had short and undistinguished academic careers. The fact of the matter is that we have not reconstructed the fossil record of human evolution from a single tooth. We have constructed it in recent years from very nearly complete fossils. And I brought one along. This is the Don't get alarmed, it's only a plaster cast. This is the Sterkfontein skull, which is an Australopithecine intermediate, and in fact there's a picture of it there along with another Australopithecine intermediate. What's the point I want to make about this? The point is, we know an awful lot about what these critters look like. They didn't look quite like apes today, and they certainly don't look quite like us. They're not human, they're somewhere in between. They're not human, that's the whole point. The next slide, please. Dr. Gish quoted from Solly Zuckerman saying Australopithecus never walked upright. You know why he quoted from Zuckerman? Zuckerman never saw the fossil in the middle. That's a complete knee joint from Australopithecus, from this guy. And you know what that fossil proved to the satisfaction of everybody in the scientific community? That it did walk upright. Next slide. This is a diagram to illustrate the point. The ape leg is at the right, and the human is at the left, and the one in the middle is of the human type, and that's the Lucy fossil. Next slide, please. Finally, even the dentary, the dentition, the jaw is intermediate between the human type and the ape type. And then finally, next slide. This is the complete Lucy skeleton. Next slide, please. There's 1470, another one of those complete skulls. And finally, if we simply take in the next slide, cranial capacities in various fossil specimens which have appeared through time and arrange them. And we put humans on the right and Lucy at the left. We have a continuous series of intermediates. We don't have any gaps.
Time.
We have it all together. Thank you.
Time, Doctor. The next and last rebuttal will be 5 minutes each, and Dr. Gish will go first. Dr. Gish, 5 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just have to say that Dr. Miller simply does not know what he's talking about when he's talking about those protein sequences. Hubert Yockey took all that into account, how much variability, how much substituting you could do on these various amino acids in his calculation. Fact is, in my correspondence with Dr. Yockey, I challenged him on it. I said, you've been too liberal here. You can't really make all those changes and get away with it. But he made these liberal assumptions. He made all these assumptions, and look, to say there's only 2 amino acids that you have to have there to do the job is a ridiculous statement. Anybody who knows biochemistry knows better than that. You have to have the active center of 15 to 20 or 30 amino acids, and they are invariant. They do not vary. And the rest of the molecule is very, very important. You start fiddling around with that, and you're going to lose all activity. And every amino acid must be a left-handed amino acid. There are 2 different kinds, right-handed and left-handed. You put in 400 left-handed amino acids and put in 1 right-handed amino acid, you will have absolutely no activity, none whatsoever. On the hypothetical primordial Earth, all amino acids would have been 50% right-handed and 50% left-handed. Now, you just make your calculations, and Yockey made these calculations. He made the most liberal assumptions possible, and he came out with that conclusion. Are we to assume that Sir Fred Hoyle didn't know what he was talking about? Are we to assume that Wick Ramasinghe didn't know what he was talking about? That they had failed to take all this into account when they made their probability calculations? These people were atheists. They didn't want to believe that. It was sufficient to convince them. And as a biochemist, I may have not been at the bench now for 10 years, Dr. Miller, but I know a lot of biochemistry, and I know much more than that. You don't go fooling around and mixing these things up. You've got to have a fairly precise structure, and all of that is taken into account in these calculations. Now, the second law of thermodynamics. I guess you people are really happy to learn that a hurricane is going to generate order and complexity. Now, the next time a hurricane comes along, you get a lot of bricks and you get a lot of lumber and you pile it on your lot, and that hurricane is going to assemble a house for you, according to Dr. Miller. Well, that's pure nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. And if Dr. Miller doesn't know the difference between forming a snowflake and evolution, I can't help him any. They're very different.
2 minutes.
They're going in exactly the opposite direction, ladies and gentlemen. In the evolution of life, you are going to higher and higher levels of energy and lower probability. When a snowflake crystallizes, when anything crystallizes, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to a lower level of energy. It's going to a more probable state. Why, the fact that water molecules arrange themselves to form crystals has nothing to do with the theory of evolution. Absolutely nothing, ladies and gentlemen. And Isaac Asimov knows You have an isolated system. He knows that. And everybody should know that. Supposed to know anything about evolution, know that in an isolated system, the total amount of complexity and order must increase with time. The entropy will increase. That is, the disorder, the randomness, the lack of orderliness will increase with time. The entropy, which is a measure of the randomness, will increase with time, totally within that system. Yet, they say within the universe, totally now within this universe, we had an increase of order and complexity and a decrease in entropy. And that is absurd, is totally contradictory to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, about this progressive increase in cranial capacity, man, I don't know where Dr. Miller gets those data, because Gould and Eldridge, in propagandizing for their punctuated equilibria, said that you have no steady progressive increase in the size of the brain of the hominids, what they believe to be hominids. There is no gradual increase, but these mammoth jumps that we see.
Time, Doctor. Time.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Dr. Miller for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to hear Dr. Gish's comments about the data I gave on protein, on calcium binding sites in protein. They're absolutely accurate. They're right down there in the last amino acid. He says you can't fool around with these things. You can. It's a fact. The sequences are there. The calcium binding sites are always the same. What can I do about it? I can say it's a fact. There it is. He says it's not. Okay. The fact of the matter is that it's out of the literature. Now, if you could put the slides I had back on, Mr. Darlington, I wanted to... I'll write you a check. I wanted to make a couple other points that I thought were very interesting. Dr. Gish immediately ridiculed the snowflake, saying a snowflake isn't alive. I know that. If snowflakes were alive, I'd certainly move down here and get away from the north. The fact of the matter is I was introducing the snowflake for a specific argument, the sort of specific argument that Dr. Gish doesn't like to get into. And that is, he says, no physicist has ever identified a process which goes from disorder to order. And I thought I'd say, okay, there's the process. There it is, and so forth and so on. Could you go one slide forward, please? Another? Thank you. That's the one that Dr. Gish didn't like, and I understand why he didn't like it, because it shows how many intermediates we have between Australopithecus and Homo sapiens. The controversy in human evolution, with Gould writing about it saying we have a jumpy increase, is precisely the sort of confusion which is caused for, because we're not sure whether all those intermediates are directly on the human line or not. The fact is, though, that each one of those bars represents an authentic specimen with a nearly complete cranium whose cranial capacity can be estimated. If you use another trait, like body size, you get the same sort of a trend. We have an enormous number of intermediates with our own species, connecting our own species with apes. Now, the next slide I want to show is slide 29, if you would, please. 29, please. That's about 10 or 15 forward. Now, you might be surprised to learn that of the two people on the stage tonight, one of them has to propose a fantastically rapid rate of evolutionary change. So rapid that no evolutionist would be bold enough to do it. For example, Dr. Gish has to propose, as he did in his opening statement, that there's an ancestral horse kind that could have evolved by something he calls horizontal evolution into horses, zebras, donkeys, onagers, and so forth and so on, because they're all a horse kind. Ladies and gentlemen, none of us old conservative evolutionists would be radical enough to propose that you could evolve horses and zebras in just 6,000 years. But that's what Dr. Gish's model demands, a very rapid rate of natural selection, productive mutation, speciation, so forth and so on. You might be interested to know that the gibbon and the simiang, two apes, must be in the same kind. And the reason for that is that a hybrid between them was formed. There's a genetic distance, meaning the difference in proteins, of 0.76 between those two. So he says they're the same kind. They evolved in 6,000 years. But there are two other organisms, species A and species B, which have a genetic distance only a little bit more, which is 0.70. And Dr. Gish says that although the gibbon and the simiang could have separated in 6,000 years, the other species couldn't have separated in 60 million. What are species A and species B? The human and the chimpanzee.
2 minutes, 2 minutes.
The final stage of any argument between scientific creationism and evolution has to do with the teaching of evolution in the schools. What creationists propose to ask for, after all, is merely a fair treatment of what they suggest are only two opposing points of view. Either the universe was created and there is a God, or it was not created, evolution science, and there is no God. They mistakenly argue that since the latter view is already offered in the schools, why not the former? As I hope I have made clear tonight, the latter view is not taught in the schools because it is not an authentic representation of evolution. The scientific nature of evolution, like all scientific theories, does not exclude a creator. Indeed, the fairness argument for the inclusion of an admittedly religious viewpoint, and Dr. Gish admitted that creationism is not science, requires an intentional misrepresentation of the nature of biological evolution. It contrives to establish a false duality between the idea of a creator and the idea of evolution, and it constantly encourages students to choose between these intentionally misrepresented extremes. Such a process misrepresents both creation and evolution. Besides, which creation view should be considered? Henry Morris's, Dr. Gish's, mine, Fred Hoyle's? They're all different, as you may have found out. What must remain as science and in the school curriculum are the factual conclusions of geology, chemistry, biology, and astronomy. The universe is a vast and ancient place. We know little of its ultimate origins, but we can clearly say that our species was not always here. We developed from a vast and magnificent process known as evolution, which unites us in the most remarkable way with every other living thing. We are one with all the universe, and if you prefer, with all creation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are now going into the question and answer section. There will be 4 questions, and then we will conclude. There will be 2 for each of the 2 speakers or debaters. To whomever the question is directed, that person will have 4 minutes. And the other party will then have 3 minutes to respond back. So we'll start with a question to Dr. Gish. These, incidentally, are questions from the audience that were selected during the intermission. This is to Dr. Gish. I was speaking with evolutionists, and they maintain that if a scientist is a creationist, he is not reputable. All reputable scientists are evolutionists. Do you have a comment?
All reputable scientists are what?
I guess it's evolutionists, I guess.
All reputable scientists are evolutionists?
Yeah, evolution.
I saw an article in one of the science journals, and this fellow said that there just weren't any creation scientists. He says, you see, when you become a creationist, you're no longer a scientist. And so, by definition, the creationists are outside of the family of scientists. You see, that's a strange definition. As a matter of fact, the Creation Research Society now has over 700 members, all of whom hold a master's or doctorate degree in some area of science, and they are all creationists. And there are literally thousands of scientists throughout the world who are not members of our society who are creationists. And the number is growing. Now, we are a minority, that's true. And I expect we always will be a minority. Not necessarily so, because the number is growing. And fact is, hundreds of thousands of students, as they hear what you've heard here tonight, and they hear the lectures on scientific creationism, are becoming convinced that creation is a better explanation. And they're going to be the scientists, the professors, and the educators of the next generation. That's going to make a tremendous difference. No, it is only evolutionists, through their peculiar definition of what a scientist is, would exclude the creationist. A scientist is one who goes out in the real world, looks at the facts, looks at the processes, looks at what's going on, and then tries to explain it. Sure, science is a study of the here and now. Evolution is not science. It's not a study of the here and now. It's trying to explain how this universe came about and how life came about. Science is a study of the real world based upon real events. And so, yes, Dr. Miller quoted me as saying that creation is not a scientific theory. He's quoting out of context, because in the very next paragraph, I state that based upon exactly the same criteria, neither is evolution a scientific theory. There is no scientific theory of origin, but there's certainly a lot of scientific evidence that can be brought to bear on that subject.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to respond to that. The question is that all reputable scientists are evolutionists. Of course, there's a lot of nonsense. I think Fred Hoyle is a reputable scientist. He doesn't think that evolution happened. I think Cuvier was a creationist and a great scientist, and he didn't think that evolution occurred. But I would point out that in each case, these people also don't think that Dr. Gish's version of creation science occurred, and that's a critical point to make. For example, Dr. Gish said what creation scientists do is they weigh the evidence very carefully. I remind you of the quote I showed from Dr. Morris, saying that this had to be true regardless of any scientific problem. No scientist is going to say, I'm going to believe something regardless of a scientific problem. You're going to abandon an idea if the facts don't support it. And what I hope that I've shown tonight is that the facts don't support simultaneous creation, young Earth, and flood geology, despite the fact that that's precisely the creationism that they were talking about. I'd also point out that Dr. Gish, of course, declined to draw an intermediate between the reptile and the bird for the very straightforward reason that most creationist scientists decline to do that, and that is that the intermediate looks too much like the real fossil, and that is Archaeopteryx, which is a skeleton essentially identical to the reptilian skeleton except for the feathers going on there. It's a very straightforward definition. For example, I would say that lots and lots and lots of reputable scientists are creationists. I certainly hope so, because I'm a Roman Catholic and I think I'm a reasonably decent scientist, and lots of other creationists in the broad sense of the word are too. For example, Wick Ramasinghe is a creationist. I hope I'm not running into ethnic or religious bias when I hear the hisses from the background. This is from the excerpt of the creation trial in Arkansas. Cross-examination closed with the witness, Wick Ramasinghe, undermining the case of the team who paid his airfare to Little Rock. Question: can any rational scientist believe that the Earth's geology can be explained by a single catastrophe? Answer: Wick Ramasinghe, no. Question: could any rational scientist believe that the Earth is less than 1 million years old? Answer: Wick Ramasinghe, no. ACLU, no more questions. Thank you. The fact of the matter is that there are lots and lots and lots and lots of creationists in the broad sense of the word who are very good scientists. There are lots of people who believe in God who make wonderful contributions to science. Einstein believed in God, and therefore I would count him as a creationist as well.
Thank you.
However, I thought I had 3 minutes.
I think that's it.
Do I get any comment? Are we allowed to comment back and forth?
No, we don't have that in the format.
Too bad.
I'll meet you at the bar.
These are my
later.
rules.
I'll see you at the bar,
No,
Dr.
I don't know who gave the rules. This will be a question to Dr. Miller. If man and ape came from a common ancestor under the same process, under the same environment, how did they become different?
Okay, that's a very fundamental question, and it simply says, how can speciation occur? In other words, given a particular individual environment, how can a new species show up? Well, I'm afraid that I can't answer how or why man and a common ancestor became different, because the fossil record isn't as detailed as it would like to be. But the fact of the matter is the question is really very basic. If you have one organism in an environment, why do you sometimes get two organisms? Sorry about the hissing, but I really think that's the essence of the question, is why do you get two different species from a common ancestor? I've tried to show the fossil record supports the notion of common ancestry, and now the question is, why do species split? That question focuses on really what is the most fundamental debate in evolutionary biology right now. And if you write a textbook and you want to talk about evolution, you have to say that this is the process of, this is something that's under hot debate. And I can tell you what some of the alternatives are, and I can tell you essentially the sorts of things that are going on. But one of the things that might be interesting to note is that speciation in a single environment does occur, and it sometimes occurs as a result of certain kinds of population pressures. Okay, I'm not trying to get around this. The question was, why are we different? The answer is, I don't know, and neither does anybody else really. Okay. Now, how can species split if we choose a species that we really know something about? For example, if we find a species in which we can really look at the forms. Now, there is a butterfly which is found in the Hawaiian Islands. And the butterfly, the genus name is Hedylepta. Hedyleptus is a genus of moth, actually. It's only found in Hawaii. Most species in the genus feed on grasses, lilies, palms, or legumes. Now, there are two species, Hedylepta maya and Hedylepta mericki, which feed exclusively on banana plants. Those two species, which look entirely different from the others, have evolved in the last 1,000 years. How do you know that? The answer is, no bananas grew in the Hawaiian Islands prior to 1,000 years ago, when they were introduced by the Polynesians. Those two species appeared after the introduction of bananas. Now, what happened was that this new species, the two I mentioned, are different from the others in mouth structure, in the parts, in behavior, and in mating preferences, because they don't mate with the other species of butterfly. Evolution, therefore, can affect the structure of the organism, the behavior of the organism, and its habitat, because it now lives in a different area. Now, I know how quick Dr. Gish's sense of humor is, and I'm over here shuddering thinking, the question was about human evolution, and I talked about butterflies. I will lay money that a great one-liner about Miller not knowing the difference between butterflies and human is coming up. But the reason I chose that thing is really very simple. And that simple reason is the fact that in this case, we have a documented example of how evolution can change the structure of an organism, its habitat, and its lifestyle. What we're looking for when we diverge into an ape-like creature and a human creature is a change, a gross change in the structure of the organism, so they look very, very different. I assure you, Hedilepta Maya never gets itself confused with the other butterflies. It doesn't mate with them, and it doesn't look like them any more than we get ourselves confused with chimpanzees, although I would grant some exceptions for those people that you have in San Diego. The fact of the matter is that there are good reasons and good models to propose that speciation occurred. And when we look at our own species, we can't be sure exactly what the reason is for divergence, but by analogy to other species, the same influences that can change structure, change habitat, and change behavior seem to be there.
Thank you, Dr.
Well, I think it's an amazing thing here that evolutionists have been studying evolution for 120 years intensely. A process is going on continuously, and they have to say right now, at this time, they don't know what the mechanism of evolution is. And that's precisely what Stephen Jay Gould said in his deposition for the trial in Arkansas. I don't know the mechanism of evolution. That's an astounding thing. And Theodoros Dobzhansky, in a book published in 1975, said, here we are 100 years after Darwin, and it's astounding that we still cannot explain the origin of races, human races. And I thought to myself, that really is astounding, because you think you can explain the origin of everything, including the origin of the universe and the origin of life, and you can't even explain the origin of races. And we've got 4 billion people here on this earth to study to try to get the answer. And they can't even solve that little problem. Why did a common ancestor, by the way, they have never found that common ancestor of ape and man. They've never found that creature. They're still looking for him. But supposedly he split. And some creatures over here, they went down and evolved independently into apes, and these creatures over here evolved down into man. How can you take the same populations and go off in such drastically different directions? In one case ending up as apes, in the other case ending up as man, starting with the same population of creatures. I would like to know exactly how that could happen. Indeed, that's a problem, and it's never been answered, and certainly I don't think, and I'm convinced, the fossil record indicates that it did not happen, as a matter of fact. Monkeys abruptly appear on this earth. Apes abruptly appear. There is no ancestors for monkeys linking them to anything else. And you don't even know where the primates themselves came from. And so it's a little bit late to be worrying about how this thing split and became man in one case and ape in another.
Thank you, Doctor. This is a question to Dr. Gish. Doctor, how do you account for the order that the fossils are found, i.e., why it looks like evolution has occurred?
How do we account for the geological column? I suggested there were several possibilities. One is that of progressive creation, which is accepted by many conservative, Bible-believing Christians, by the way. Some leading theologians accept that position, maintaining that the word yom, meaning day in the Bible, does not necessarily mean a 24-hour day. And so they accept the idea of progressive creation. There's the other concept of gap theory. And so they can be explained very nicely within those concepts. The other possibility is that of creation in literally 6 days, as suggested in the Bible. We have not discussed the Bible here tonight. That's not to be discussed. But this is the question, I think, how do we account for that geological column? I assume within the framework of this sudden creation. But if you take the marine invertebrates, for example, the Cambrian animals, I didn't have time to discuss those. Those are bottom-dwelling creatures. And if they were overwhelmed with a flood, they would be buried first, and they'd be buried in the sea. Horses are not found there in the Cambrian because they didn't live in the sea. They lived on continental areas. And Dr. Morris has worked this out, being an expert in hydrology, having a PhD in hydrology, and he maintains that you would get this distribution through this vast worldwide flood, which one may postulate with its tide sweeping back and forth across the earth, burying the invertebrates first, fishes would be higher. Certainly they would be higher and buried subsequently. Some of those fishes are found in Cambrian rocks, by the way. That's been a recent development. The amphibians, the land, water boundary, and reptiles and mammals and so forth in their own particular ecological zone or geographical area. And it's interesting that evolutionists at time to time appeal to such an ecological zone idea. Romer, for example, mentions that certain amphibians are not found along with reptiles, although they coexisted supposedly at the same time. He says because they lived in different areas, they're not found as fossils together. Axelrod explained why you find fossils, the little seeds of higher plants in Cambrian rocks, but don't find their actual fossils. He said they were in existence at the Cambrian 600 million years ago. These not flowering plants, vascular plants, woody plants, but they lived in the uplands, and they were not fossilized down here in the lowlands. They were in existence. In fact, as he said, they must have come into existence before the Cambrian. But we don't find their fossils there because they were up in the uplands, which were fossilized later. So they appeal to such a possibility, as do the creation, not as universally as we would on the flood model.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Miller?
Dr. Gish gave two shots at trying to explain the fossil record. Now, the first one I think is really fun, because I'm going to write a letter to Henry Morris, and you're going to be in trouble when you go back. This is a book by Henry Morris called The Remarkable Birth of Planet Earth. Jerry Falwell sent this to me. I wrote in a little postcard about what I thought about evolution. I got a free book. I'm very grateful. Dr. Morris writes, progressive creation, though presenting a better image than theistic evolution in its terminology, is even more objectionable to true creationists in its theology. It seems completely impossible for the God of the Bible to coexist with the geological age system at all, regardless of whether they are identified with a theistic evolutionary or a progressive creation framework. Dr. Gish wants to say some people believe that, but the fact of the matter is that he doesn't, his boss doesn't, his institute doesn't, and furthermore, the creation science law in Arkansas specifically ruled out progressive creation by talking about relatively recent inception of living kinds. Progressive creation accepts the geological age system. So running into progressive creation is not really very good at all. The second thing, Mr. Darlington, boy, I tell you, I'm going to owe you a lot. Could you put the second carousel on, and could you go to slide 20, please? Dr. Gish made the suggestion that the reason, for example, I think he said horses and invertebrates appear separately in the fossil record is because if we had a flood, horses would have run to higher ground or would have been up higher, and they, could you go to slide 20, please? Invertebrates crawling down on the bottom would not have been in that particular situation. So what you can do, therefore, is this slide 20? What do we got here? Can you read the numbers? It should be number 20. Can you go back a slide? I'm sorry this is taking so much time. I don't think I'll run out, though. All right.
About 30 seconds.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm just waiting for... Okay, there it is. These three animals, had they existed together, would have lived side by side. They're an ichthyosaur, a shark, and a dolphin. Now, according to Dr. Gish's model, they'd all be swimming side by side. They'd all be buried at the same place in the fossil record. That's a straightforward prediction. Does that occur? Not at all. The shark, in fact, appears first, then the ichthyosaur, and then the swimming mammal. And you know what else? The swimming mammal doesn't appear until after the first mammal appears on land. The whole notion that the fossil record represents separate ecological zones is completely bankrupt. And it's bankrupt for the reason that if it were correct, swimming mammals would be fossilized alongside with the first swimming fishes hundreds of millions of years before the first land mammal doesn't show up. This model, progressive creation, fails a theological test, and this one fails a factual test.
Thank you, Doctor. The last question is to Dr. Miller. You showed me a fly with 2 wings and a fly with 4 wings. It's still a fly. How does that prove one species changes to another species?
Okay, that's a very straightforward question. Every time an evolutionist shows a straightforward change, it's still a fly, and that's a very valid point. For example, the change of coloration in moths in England in the 19th century, which is very well documented. They're still moths. They might be a little darker. The sheep with the shorter legs, it's still a sheep, and so forth and so on. Here's what I would like to submit to you, and that is that if evolutionary biologists were right on the money, if I was right about everything I had said tonight, for sure, everything was absolutely true. You don't accept that, but let's suppose that I was. And all that had really happened. And you had been standing around, let us say, when Triceratops evolved, and you saw some monoclonius running around with the one big horn and the two little ones, and then some eggs hatched out. Some more monoclonius came out, except these had three big horns. I'd say evolution. And you'd look at me and you'd say, no. That's just a monoclonius with two bigger horns, the same thing. If we were looking at the reptile to mammal sequence, and you saw this progressive change in the dentary, and you saw the inner ear things coming, I'd say, look, that's evolution. And you would say, no, it isn't. It's just a reptile with a slightly different jaw. So forth and so on, and so forth and so on. Every single change that has occurred in the fossil record, even if evolutionists are absolutely right, were you there to observe the change, even the really dramatic ones, you would simply be saying, there's a monoclonius with a couple of extra horns. That's nothing but a reptile with these funny little things sticking out all over its body that they'll later call feathers. That's nothing but a reptile with a different type of jaw. That's nothing but a mammal whose legs look a little bit more like flippers, and so forth and so on. The only point that I want to make is that the sort of change evidenced by the two-winged fly, which one chooses to still call a fly, is absolutely the sort of change that is required for evolution to have produced new species from old. It squares perfectly with the fossil record. It squares perfectly with the facts of genetics.
Thank you, Dr. Gish.
Well, we've been on this earth for, they say, 1,000,000 years. Man has been here 1,000,000 years, and all these creatures have been here for millions of years. There's plenty of time to have these intermediate forms right now. This excuse cannot be applied. Oh, well, evolution is so slow. Of course we don't see these intermediate forms. It takes a long time. We've been here a long time, according to evolution. We ought to have plenty of these. Now about that fly, the four-winged fly. What Dr. Miller did not tell you is those two other wings replace the halteres in the fly. The halteres are the control organs of the fly. And so that thing is not going to fly. He is a terrible misfit and a terrible creature, and he's no improvement, evolutionary improvement at all. By some freak, the tissue which generates the halteres, these two control structures on the fly, that portion of tissue had been replaced by the tissue which produces wings. So he's a freak, like a two-headed sheep or something like that. He's got four wings. But that's not evolution. There's no evolutionary change. There's no evolutionary improvement. And he's a monster that can't fly. And he's going in the opposite direction of if he wanted to evolve. Now, look, if that's the kind of example that evolutionists have to support evolution, then indeed evolution is in serious trouble. Indeed. They have not one example on this earth of a nascent organ or a nascent structure, something new and novel that is in the process of coming into being. Not one. You heard what I said, Colin Patterson said. He had no transitional forms in his book. He said, if I knew of any, either among living creatures or among the fossils, I certainly would have included them. Why then didn't he include a picture of the four-winged fly, if that's supposed to be a transitional form, which it is not?
Thank you, Doctor. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a great audience. I think that oftentimes the debate sometimes is for purposes of fortifying our own beliefs. Whether that's true or not, I think tonight you had an intellectual feast, a great debate, and I think that you would like to join with me in thanking two great gentlemen who have been here tonight and I think had an outstanding debate, Dr. Gish and Dr. Miller.
Two minutes. No. Thank you very much. Good night.